Hey everybody, Ivan here again with another video that's multiple hours long and I will refer to as brief, concise, a summary, and just a primer on the things that you need to know about a particular topic. To be fair, this topic is something that would take years and years of dedicated research to fully understand, and even then, I don't know that you'd really be able to wrap your head all the way around all of the moving pieces that went on around today's subject. Of course, that subject is the M14 rifle. Now, because we can't really get a good comprehensive picture, what I'd like to focus most on is the development of the M14. Where did it come from? How did it come about? How did we end up with this? Meanwhile, the sort of thing, right, I always like to say what a video is not. This video is not a comprehensive look at what led to the M14 getting the reputation that it has today. We're more or less just looking at pre-adoption and up to the moment of adoption itself, and we may just trickle just a little bit past that point at the very end of this video. But we're going to be hours of content alone just looking at the things that happened before its adoption. And I think that's where the most misunderstanding and the most confusion surrounding the M14 actually come from. Because frankly, you can sum up what went wrong with the M14 in about 30 minutes. Now, how you got to the point that things could go wrong is a really, really long twisting story. And in fact, that's where I got the title for this video from. Uneasy twistings. This was a coin termed by R. Blake Stevens. He was the author of both of the books that we're going to be sort of using as reference material, as sources for these things today. R. Blake Stevens was in charge he ran collector grade publications, and they put together essentially, not quite comprehensive, but as close to comprehensive as a book can get, tomes on subjects relating to things like the AR-15's development, or in our case, the FAL's development and the M14's development. Between these two books, there's like 1,000 pages of material. I won't tell you I've read all 1,000 pages, but I think at this point I'm at like 700 or 800 of them. I've devoted a lot of time to trying to catch up to the story of these two rifles. Now, what I want the thesis of this video to be, so that the thing to keep in the back of your mind the whole time that I'm going through this entire breakdown is, right, here's our thesis. The M14 was a better rifle than the FAL at the time it was adopted. This is not controversial. The United States government, if to the extent it played favorites, there was more favoritism played in favor of the FAL than the M14. I know that's going to be controversial. That's contrary to what most videos about this subject will tell you. However, I came at this video wanting to prove those theories true, right? That's how I wanted this to go. However, after reading through the reports and reading through the information that's available and reading through the opinions of all various people who were around at the time, I come to the shocking conclusion that I'm going to have to defend the M14, and that pains me. I don't want it to sound like I'm an M14 fan. Of course, I think it's a neat rifle, right? Like any American would. But the M14 is gravely misunderstood, and it really caught a bad reputation as a result of politics, which is interesting because many people will point to politics as being the only reason the M14 was adopted, and it's frankly untrue. It's demonstrably, in fact, will demonstrate how untrue that really is. Now, any sort of serious analysis of this story is going to involve an overwhelming number of people, places, government institutions, agencies, different developmental boards. The Army at this point in America's history especially is a gargantuan ball of spiders, if that analogy makes sense. Where trying to peel away one spider just lets the ball of spiders unravel, and then you've got a million spiders crawling on you. So I will do my best to avoid having you guys have to keep up with like 20 different people's, 30, 40, 50 different people's names, and having to keep up with like the 20, 30 different agencies that were involved in these sorts of things. So I will sometimes oversimplify to say that Army Ordnance, when I'm referring to Springfield Armory's end of this sort of things, or I'll say Springfield when I mean Army Ordnance, but they're sort of on their own island of thinking and way of approaching things in this story. Meanwhile, I'll refer to the Army at large as Big Army or the rest of the Army or these sorts of things. I'll refer to Garand when what I actually mean is people that worked for Garand. Believe it or not, Garand was not the only guy involved in the development of the M1 Garand. Other people helped him. There were other people that were like massively influential along the way. It was very specifically several Marines were responsible for a lot of those developmental Garands that sort of, we'll talk about, we'll get through, sort of fold into the M14 much later in history. I'm going to generally refer to them as just Garand's assistants, which is probably insulting to them, a little bit of an oversimplification, but we can't be here giving you hours-long discussion on just these people's lives, though that could be a video in and of itself. Now, of course, having mentioned Garand, right, no discussion of the M14 can start somewhere that isn't at the beginning. And in this case, the beginning goes back a long, long way. Now, the book really misses a couple of Garand's prototypes here, and I do want to use this opportunity to try and just say it once and get out of the way. These books are not the end-all be-all source of study on these topics. They were written at a time more or less before the internet, especially the internet as we know it today, existed. And while Stevens went and talked to everybody, went and collected all of the original sources, went and compiled all of these things in one place, some information has come to light since then that Stevens wasn't privy to. For example, he doesn't write very much at all about how many primer-actuated prototype self-loading rifles Garand had. He had a lot of them. Garand was sort of obsessed with this idea of primer actuation, and he stuck around with it for a surprisingly long time. And we'll touch on it briefly here, although the primer-actuated rifle development is sort of only incidental to the history of the Garand, because, of course, being a very different operating system, the rifles worked very differently than the sort of rifles that are going to be core to our story here. Now, the first key things that you'll need to know about Garand. Everybody wants to call him a Canadian. He came to the U.S. when he was young enough that I'm going to claim him as American. He did not come of age in Canada. He came of age in America, and he considered himself an American. Perhaps that was his way of apologizing for being Canadian, in which case I will accept him as an American. Anyway, we've got a picture here of one of his early primer-actuated prototypes. If you're curious about the primer-actuated prototypes, Ian from Forgotten Weapons, who I do want to poke a little bit of fun at, has bungled some details of the M14 story in some past videos, but his videos on the Garand primer-actuated prototypes are quite good. You can go and watch those to get a better idea of where Garand was coming from with these things. But it's pretty evident he was coming up with novel ideas. He did not, much like Eugene Stoner, right, didn't come from a very gun design background field, much like Kalashnikov even. And this led to him coming up with some pretty strange ways of doing things, right? Because he wasn't brought up and bred in this is how it's always been done. So he approaches this with a fresh pair of eyes, if you will. So his primer-actuated prototypes never really amount to much of anything. The reason he starts making these primer-actuated prototypes is because, of course, the U.S. military is interested in self-loading rifles. He's involved in a standards division of the U.S. government. Of course, standards, as that term is used in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, more or less refers to materials and measurement standards. Of course, replaceable parts was becoming more than just a concept at this point in history, especially as it applied to small arms. And there was a great big national thrust in the United States to actually get to the point that you can say, well, if you take steel of this composition and you heat it to this, you heat it, you put it through these processes, you machine it like this, you can be pretty sure it's about this strong. So material certification, how can you say a steel is a grade of steel? Much effort was put in by the United States, and in fact most first world countries, to do these sorts of things. It's difficult. I guess I've got an engineering background, so it will be difficult for me to explain to you guys how incredibly impressive it is for it. This is truly a nation level task. It's going to be all of the universities in the country working together on this, all of the industry in the country working together on this, to get you to the point that you can say this is 4140 steel. This is tool steel. This is this kind of steel. Very, very difficult to get to that point. Lots of money goes into it, lots of research development, and Garand finds himself wrapped up in some of this. Now, the U.S. Army, or the U.S. government at large, really, is mostly interested in this for warfighting reasons. Of course, there's logistical reasons, reasons of national industry, but most of that is military reasons. And of course, semi-auto rifle development was something that was at the forefront of many different countries' minds. It's just that most countries, much aside, there are notable exceptions. The United States pulls it off. France technically pulled it off before World War I and then during World War I, which was very impressive. Of course, there's the Mondragon rifle, but there was many nations that were very interested in being able to adopt a self-loading rifle. But it would be difficult to adopt a self-loading rifle without first having standardized steel. And the United States gets it in its mind that it should come up with a rifle that's fully interchangeable parts, very modern manufacturing. Like, they're looking forward to the future, and not 10 years in the future, but 20, 30 years in the future, whenever they're putting together the ideas for what a self-loading rifle is going to be. So Garand, while working at the standards factory, goes ahead and puts together his first primer actuated prototype. It does at least work, but of course it's too heavy, it's too cumbersome, and probably, frankly, just looking at primer actuation in general, it's not going to be reliable enough to make the Army happy. But he ends up being offered a position at Springfield Armory to pursue further development of those sorts of ideas. Now, I don't want to overdo the explanation of what Springfield Armory was, so the things that I will say is it's completely different from the Springfield Armory that's based in Illinois today, totally unrelated entities. Springfield Armory often catches a bad rap for one reason or another because it was sort of disgraced by the time it was shut down by Department of Defense. However, Springfield Armory was, if not fundamental to the development of standards themselves, because again, right, military rifles and the development of standards, as explained, were more or less completely intertwined. But Springfield Armory was there to more or less design or to look to the future for the next generation of firearms, figure out what ideas worked, what ideas didn't, by coordinating with the rest of the bigger army to test these sorts of ideas that Springfield would put together. And eventually then Springfield would be able to take these ideas and then share them with the broader U.S. arms manufacturing industry, and then manufacture weapons in large numbers because of this. The 1911 pistol, this ends up working well with, although that wasn't a Springfield... Springfield wasn't the one that was doing the developmental work on that, but they'd certainly seen it was possible then. And World War I caught the United States by enough of a surprise that Springfield's charter was really kicked into high gear after World War I, that if we are ever caught by surprise or caught unprepared in a war again, we have to be able to launch mass manufacture of rifles, and we need to be able to tool up in like 2 to 3 months instead of it being like 2 years and the war's over by the time that we're actually tooled up to make our own stuff and not just leech off of the scumbag French, the beleaguered scumbag French, giving us rifles that weren't built properly. But that was more or less the idea at this time for Springfield Armory. So John Garand is now working there, and he's tasked with, ends up being given a pretty serious list of requirements for what the Army's actually looking for in a modern military rifle. While these list of requirements would change and evolve a little bit over time, as laid out as early as 1909, the Ordnance Department, so again, Ordnance Department is more or less hand in hand with Springfield Armory. The criteria that they put forth are as listed here. Probably the most interesting things to point out is they were interested in something 30 caliber. It needed to have a magazine, of course, and it needed to have a capacity of not less than 8. However, they'd be willing to entertain a rifle that had a 5-shot capacity that could be loaded reasonably quick, and this magazine thing would go back and forth several times. It is also worth mentioning that, of course, the BAR existed by this time, and so everybody was aware magazines work. And this is probably the first major point of contention with the M14's development history that I want to call attention to. We'll call much more attention to it later on because it is, again, with our uneasy twistings, right, we'll really see that this theme shows up again and again and again. And constantly there's sort of confusion and an inconsistent picture of what it is that the Army actually wants of the Army. But Garand's first primer actuated prototypes are magazine fed, much like the BAR was. However, the Army at this point in time had legitimate issues that they had taken with the idea of a detachable magazine rifle being general issued to the infantry. While we didn't really see this in World War I, in World War II, we'd see at least part of this proven right, that it was difficult to keep BARs supplied with enough magazines that were kept in working order because, of course, magazines do get damaged if they're reusable items especially. And it was difficult to keep BAR gunners equipped with enough magazines that they could keep in running working order, that they could load into the gun and just have work, and then have enough magazines that have rounds loaded in them on their body to be able to provide a sufficient volume of fire to actually suppress and use an automatic rifle the way an automatic rifle that was sort of pressed into a GPMG role would be expected to do, would be needed to do. So the sort of premonitions that they had even pre-World War I about general issue magazine rifles did end up being proven true come World War II. Even though the rifles weren't even general issued, there were still logistical problems getting BARs their magazines. So, to back us up, right, Garand's 1919-1920 primer actuated prototypes do feed from magazines, but by the time that the U.S. Army's requirements for what their new self-loading magazine rifle should be are coming to fruition, the United States Army is pretty sure they do not want something that's detachable magazine. And you have to stop and think about why and consider their reasonings, especially in the context of the time, for this to make sense. Because of course we realize that, come 30, 40 years later, magazines would have come a long enough way that certainly magazine rifles were vastly superior. Generally speaking, the oppositions to magazines came along the lines of, logistical issues were certainly very legitimate there, because we had just managed to figure out how to make things consistently enough interchangeable parts were a real thing. Now trying to expand that to a mass manufactured item that also you need to make cheap enough, that also you have to make available in sufficient, not just the volume, but the consistency that you keep these things in manufacture, right? You've got to have a production line for magazines that just doesn't stop, which isn't always entirely conducive to the way that you're used to making guns anyway. So there's a lot of logistical concerns that go on. Additionally, there's a lot of legitimate combat concerns. One big concern was, okay, you've run a magazine dry, you load, you go ahead and go through all the magazines you have in your combat load. What do you do with your rifle now? You're kind of down to single loading, because again, it was assumed that packaging ammunition in magazines even these days isn't logistically efficient, isn't logistically feasible. And certainly back then, it was absolutely not. And so the major concern was, okay, so we're going to, our supply to troops of ammo is going to be loose rounds or rounds on stripper clips, and then they're going to have these loose magazines on their person. Let's say they've got 160 rounds in a combat loadout. Well, if they're in a firefight that takes more than 160 rounds, what are they doing at this point? Taking loose rounds or rounds on stripper clips and trying to stuff them into magazines, however clumsy that may be, in the dark, in the cold, in the mud, in the rain. And this is just going to introduce a whole slew of problems. Magazines are going to get dropped or damaged or lost. If you're busy stuffing a magazine and you realize you have to move and you leave the magazine behind, what if that was your last magazine? Now you've got a rifle that may or may not even work as a single shot. And so, of course, one of the requirements that was listed was the rifle has to be capable of working without a magazine in, if you got no magazine around, you still have to be able to at least single shot the gun. So the Army had a lot of legitimate, at the time, complaints against magazines. Certainly the logistics complaints are the most legitimate, but probably the second most legitimate is like battlefield logistics wise. And doctrinally, that's going to be a very large hurdle to try and hop. And certainly the BAR's service in World War II panned out some of these ideas, that it is difficult, especially with the high quality steel magazines that are heavy. Heavy is always a problem, but high quality steel magazines that, despite being heavy, are fragile. And BAR magazines were constantly prone to getting dents in the bodies that would bind up followers, feed lips getting damaged. Even when magazines were handled gently, right, having a magazine in your kit and then falling down on the ground hard could damage magazines. So there was a laundry list of problems that Army was very concerned about that sort of precluded the possibility of a magazine-fed Garand being adopted at this time. So that was a very long sidetrack, and we will sidetrack on this sidetrack more, I promise you, because the same debate comes up again and again and again. But for now, the important thing to keep in your mind is they were aware magazine rifles were possible. They just didn't want that. And the reasons for not wanting that, frankly, when things ended up playing out, were more right than they were wrong, at least given the logistics and the manufacturing and the industrial circumstances of the time that they were living in. And I know a lot of people like to apply today's lens to that decision, going, well, wasn't the Army so stupid, bunch of stick-in-the-mud old-timers? No, they weren't that. They were trying to adopt a rifle, design a rifle that was going to be 20, 30 years ahead of what anybody else on Earth had. That's not stick-in-the-mud. That's very forward-thinking. It's just that their forward-thinking, the way it worked out was, you don't need a magazine. And later on, we'll talk about some trials where M14s and FALs and the like were compared to the M1 Garand. And the things that you'll find may end up surprising you to this end. So, now to simplify a gigantic slice of history that on its own could be a multi-hour video, the M1 Garand were adopted. It went through its own set of trials, it went through its own tribulations. Probably most interesting about this is the fact that Garand and Springfield and Army Ordnance And then supposedly the army at large was very concerned about the idea of having a gas port drilled in the barrel of the rifle. Again, to give you guys a picture of the logistical and scientific and developmental acumen, right? Like, this is how the world worked at this time. They thought having a gas port on a rifle would lead to inaccuracy and severe gas port erosion, which would lead to barrel erosion and guns being very inaccurate. So the initial gas system they designed for the Garand is a gas trap system where the gas block sort of encompasses the end of the muzzle, and excess muzzle gas coming out of the end of the barrel is captured and then used to force the operating mechanism backwards. These Garand are not terribly reliable. They're plagued with problems, and in fact, the entire early history of the Garand is a rifle that's just plagued with problems, from things like the 7th round stop, to clips not wanting to lock in, to bolts not wanting to go forward, to guns wanting to jam, to wood not being very tolerant to different climatic situations, if it's too cold or too hot or too wet or too dry, guns do or don't want to run. So the Garand is plagued with its own fair share of early issues, right? But this is just how rifle development and adoption goes. Early on is the time, in your very early prototype production, you're not going to see these issues as often because these guns are effectively being handmade. Now, in low-rate initial production, you're also not really going to see these problems show up that much because in that low-rate production, the guns aren't being handmade, but the guns are being made slowly enough that you're able to gauge and check everything multiple times to make sure everything's perfect, make sure every gun goes together just fine. Whenever you hit that sort of ramp up to full-scale mass production, I don't know that there's a single military rifle I've been able to find evidence of where everything just worked great. Usually there's at least a couple of years of this rifle that used to look like it was so reliable and everything works great is now an absolute dog. It's a pig, nothing wants to work right, it jams, nobody can seem to figure out what the problem is, and then slowly but surely they begin unraveling this ball of spiders and things work right? The Garand was no stranger to this development. And that could be a video all on its own, but we'll only touch on sort of the highlights of that because the highlights of those sort of issues with the Garand end up serving a unintended basis for the development of the M14 much later in history. Chapter 2 in this book really launches into detail about this. The wartime's experiments with the M1. Of course, the United States had adopted the M1 prior to World War II, and by the time we were really involved in World War II, most of the issues with the M1 Garand had been worked out. There would be a substantial number of revisions and updates and changes to the guns as the war went on. Most of these changes didn't have to do with structure, and they had to do with making a part cheaper or making a part slightly stronger or with a more sustainable manufacturing method. It was just sort of logistical production tweaks more so than the gun doesn't work, we have to fix this problem. However, the rifle did have some such problems that were known throughout the history, throughout all of World War II. These were known issues. The rifles that sort of not necessarily spawned in as an answer to these problems, but the sort of developmental M1 Garand rifles were known as the M1Es. Multiple different rifles were come up here. This was more or less exclusively a Springfield run thing, although some of the rifles weren't exclusively designed by Springfield. The ideas came from other places. But to give you guys the idea, right, Springfield during the war was actively involved in trying to make the M1 Garand a better rifle. Now, this would end up not really going anywhere because most of the things that they came up with that would make the Garand a better rifle would involve retrofitting the millions of rifles that were either in production or already produced and out in the field, and that was just never going to be logistically feasible. So not a ton of stuff came of this, although we get the sniper Garands that came out of this, and to some extent we got things that would show up much later in the M14 out of this. And in fact, we even had an AG-42 style gas impingement system where there's a gas port that comes off the barrel that brings the gas back to the operating rod, because of course the Garand's gas system, being originally designed as that gas trap system, ended up having a gas port drilled, but right about just like a couple inches before the muzzle, and there is a smaller gas volume available to you. Of course, the smaller gas pressure is going to give you smaller gas volume overall, that far out down the barrel. Additionally, the amount of dwell time, right, and dwell time is that time that the bullet has passed the gas, the gas port, and gas is acting on the operating mechanism of the rifle. The amount of dwell time that you're going to have in the M1 Garand is really, really short. And the M1 Garand would end up having a lot of issues due to this short dwell time, where the M1 Garand either wants to cycle violently or it doesn't want to cycle cycle reliably at all. This was sort of compounded with the fact that the gas block was a removable part that had to be removed to service the firearm. So removing, because the gas block is now a removable part, it's not press fit tight onto the barrel. And because of that, there's gas leakage between the gas block and the barrel. Adding to that short dwell time, this is just a recipe for a gun that needs to be overgassed in order to cycle reliably. Just sort of the nature of the beast as it was found. Now, amongst all of these M1E series rifles, sort of the ones that we most want to look at are these ones that played with different gas systems, these ones that played with modified cam angles, the ones that played with the roller lug, because these were all trying to address a particular problem with the M1 Garand. This section of the book just sort of goes over the different gas systems. All of the different gas systems are pertinent to the M14 because these ideas all show up again in the M14. Sort of the two things I want to mention is that John Garand himself felt that the direct impingement system that brought gas back in a gas tube to sort of push on a shortened M1 Garand op rod was his favorite design. And the sort of the white piston, as it's known, is that short stroke piston that works on this phony fixed gas volume cutoff system that ends up showing up in the M14. We'll talk about both of those in a little bit more detail later on because it is not pertinent for now. Of course, more silly Garands, a funny paratrooper Garand prototype, or sniper Garand prototypes. But as we come down here, one of the variants we'll come across is our first select fire Garand. This book incorrectly credits this as being Garand's adaptation. This was actually a guy that was working with Garand that had come up with this. But early on there, I guess early on in World War II, right, there were again attempts to take the Garand and make it take a magazine. People often confuse Garand's early primer actuated magazine rifles as being, well, Garand designed the M1 Garand to have magazines from the beginning, and the Army said no. That's not really true. Garand's early designs, yes, did have a magazine, but the Army was pretty sure from the beginning they didn't really want a magazine rifle. They'd have to be convinced to take one anyway. And the weight requirements for the Army's new self-loading rifle were such that it would be really, really difficult to make a magazine-fed rifle. Because, of course, the mag-fed Garands were all over that initial weight limit in the first place. And the one criticism that pretty much everybody had about the Garand was that it is already too heavy. Adding more weight to that would have soured the Army's embrace of such an advanced rifle as it was already so sufficiently advanced. Putting something like magazines on it and making it heavier would have really only soured them on the idea because they were already reluctant about magazines in the first place. So, the first true M1 Garand magazine prototypes come about there later on. Additionally, they're made select fire. There's scant, the reason they did this is, I suppose, one of these things where it's the most obvious answer is probably the correct one. They had magazines sitting around. They're here to develop improved Garands. They realized that the Garand could probably just outright replace the BAR, and it would be lighter than the BAR, a little bit more of a light-duty, more assaulting-friendly version of the same basic thing. So, early prototype mag-fed select fire Garands show up there during World War II. This rifle in particular, right, that first select fire rifles end up being known as the T20. The names here at this point aren't super important, but these T names will end up becoming confusing. So I will try and not fill you guys' brains up with all of these different T names at this point. But to back up a little bit from our select fire friend, a lot of these prototype M1E rifles, right, these experimental rifles, were trying to solve a problem that the M1 Garand was found to have, which was known as action freeze. In a nutshell, of course, those familiar with the way the M1 Garand works, it's got a very long, complex operating rod underneath the rifle. This operating rod was something that most manufacturers, outside of Springfield, had looked at and gone, that is impossible to manufacture. Impossible is thrown around an awful lot with several of the Garand's parts, that it would be too complicated or too infeasible. And, frankly, Springfield pulled off a miracle in manufacturing a rifle that was, it's an eminently not manufacturable rifle. But Springfield managed to put in the developmental work to make something like this possible. But of course, the operating rod is that large part. It's a several foot long part that has to be true and straight. It's got two bends and a thin tube, and it has to be true and straight within 5/1000ths of an inch to work properly. And also, it's 2 feet long. And for any of you that are familiar with manufacturing, it's a nightmare. And they had to manufacture a lot of these, and it has to hold up as the action's cycling violently. So impressive to say that it works at all. However, the M1 Garand's operating rod and action was found to have one substantial weakness. When the rifle was subjected to especially warm rain, because warm rain washes away lubricant even better than cold rain, but whenever the rifle had insufficient lubricant, be that from a result of firing the rifle enough, or just inclement conditions, or especially in the rain, the rifle would have what's known as action freeze. This would happen whenever the operating rod would lurch backwards after a round's been fired to begin to try to cycle the action, but the operating rod would be unable to rotate the bolt. And so then the parts, the operating rod would lock up tight against the receiver as the bolt locked up tight against the receiver. They'd lock up tight at the cam lug, and the gun would be more or less frozen. Resolving action freeze would usually take kicking on the operating rod to try and free it. Sometimes kicking the operating rod wouldn't free it, and the gun would need to be disassembled. Sometimes hit with something like your helmet or a hammer, anything nearby to try and free up the rifle. And this was a widespread enough issue that Springfield launched investigations, was able to replicate the issue across a wide series of rifles. So it wasn't just one manufacturer's rifle had this issue. It was endemic to the M1's action itself. So they set about trying to see if there was a way that they could tweak the rifle's design to minimize how often this issue had. They tried all sorts of things, including fluting the chamber to make extraction easier. It turns out that didn't help, right? It wasn't extraction friction that was causing action freeze to happen. It was simply that friction, that tendency to bind up between the lug on the bolt and the cam track in the operating rod itself. They tried tweaking the cam angles there on the operating rod itself to try and make it so it was more gentle, a slower unlocking phase, so you had a little bit more leverage, right? That force over time. That lever arm was increased to give you a little bit more leverage. That was found to have a beneficial impact. However, it would require replacing parts on every single rifle that was already in the field, which wasn't going to be ideal. They tried changing surface treating, heat treating things differently, applying different platings and finishes didn't make a gigantic difference. They tried increasing the cycling power of the rifle. So the thought was, well, if it's locking up because it as it's lurching backwards, maybe if it's given just a little bit more oomph, like in the cases where you're capable of freeing action freeze just by kicking on the operating rod. Perhaps it is possible that increasing the gas port diameter, much larger than it already was, would get the rifle to have enough energy it would consistently cycle reliably. This didn't necessarily end up having intended consequences because, of course, with a larger gas port diameter, if you did have action freeze, the chances that your op rod would get bent as a result of binding up so violently was increased. Now, going down here, they, of course, tested these ideas, and, of course, another one of these ideas, and this is one that, spoiler alert, will show up in the M14 because this was deemed to sort of be the ideal fix to this, was to put a roller lug on the bolt. So instead of it being just two solid pieces of steel that interact, now the lug on the bolt was going to have a rolling feature, which would more or less prevent them from being able to bind up against each other, because instead of wanting to bind up, that lug on the bolt can just roll, sort of account for that slop that's going to take place, rather than having that slop end up becoming something that can lock these pieces against each other. In testing all of these different features, you can sort of see the results of their various different tests. Of course, these rounds fired successfully is a little bit misleading because they were using, they were using simulated rainfall that was higher temperature than I think you'd ever find rain. I think it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit rain that they were simulating to sort of induce failures on these rifles quicker, because they knew that the failures were going to happen one way or the other as lubrication got washed off. One of the most successful things that they found is that using a modified mutton tallow, so this rendered animal fat, was actually a very successful lubricant, very water resistant, more water resistant than the petroleum-based lubricants. As far as our roller lug, though, they wet tested it for 400 rounds, right? So it outperformed mutton tallow. They then fired this rifle for 13,500 more rounds, and then did the rain test again, and it had action lock at 240 rounds. So certainly the indication there is that the roller lug was by far the best fix. But again, that's a retrofit of every existing rifle, and it's going to be retrofitting parts that are sort of more core to the rifle than ancillary things. You're replacing the core of the action itself at that point. So that change never ended up being implemented, though if World War II had drug on for much longer, it probably wouldn't be impossible that new issue Garands would have had this change, because it did come closer than anything else to fixing the problem. Of course, the temporary fix that was adopted was to put lubriplate in the cleaning kits for the M1 Garand, and to instruct on putting a healthy dollop of that grease between the bolt lug and on all of the surfaces that may bind up. Lubriplate is a highly water resistant, but not really very slick sort of grease, is a good way to think about it. And that was sort of the band-aid fix that was put on the Garand through the rest of World War II and beyond. In fact, even in Korea, I believe lubriplate was still like the go-to. This is how you fix the gun. Although the problems that the M1 Garand ran into in Korea was that it was too cold, and that when it gets too cold, grease can end up causing the gun to bind up. And that then in Korea, it was an opposite problem of now they need to start taking grease off of firearms to get them to run reliably, which is just sort of a funky way that those things work out. But that was more or less the M1 Garand's development there in World War II. Of course, we got our technical manual for that select fire mag-fed variant. Along the line there, Remington also develops their own more or less same basic thing, a magazine-fed Garand. However, the important things to realize here is that that very early Garand prototype, right, that fed from mag the T20, the major issue that they had realized that the M1 Garand's action has is that feeding from a magazine, as opposed to the clips that the Garand was designed to use, the magazine itself is so long that when the bolt is all the way retracted, the bolt only just barely clears the rear end rim of the round in the magazine. The problem this presents is that when this rifle is cycling as fast as the Garand cycles, which compared to other guns is really, really fast, right? It's got a very fast cycling action. The magazine would consistently get outrun by the bolt. So the bolt comes all the way to the back. It just barely gets behind the rim of the cartridge. The cartridge starts to come up in the magazine, but the bolt's already closed on top of it. In order to address this problem, they actually stretched the rear heel on the Garand receiver, and you can see that very obviously here on this picture of this T20E1. They actually stretched the travel that the bolt has to let it come back a little bit extra further. This had the other added benefit of slowing down how fast the M1 Garand's action cycles, which was something that, frankly, a select fire version of the Garand needed in the first place, because ordinarily the thing's going to try and run about 800 rounds per minute, and through different various versions, with that extra added travel, they were able to slow the Garand down to, in some reports, like 500 to 600 rounds per minute, which is substantially more controllable. Now, all this fun development with mag-fed Garands brings us more or less to the end of World War II, and it introduces us to this gentleman, Colonel René Studler. René Studler is often thought of or represented as the villain of this story, right? Because stories always need their villains. And Studler is, I think, misunderstood by many who go to try and tell the M14 story, particularly because Studler didn't like the M14 itself anyway. Studler only threw his support behind the M14 after the rifle that he preferred was found to be unsuitable, and Studler was out the door well before the M14 was actually adopted in the first place. He more or less retired and threw in the towel. Now, to the extent that Studler is a quote-unquote villain in this story, it will come from the cartridge that he believes is superior and should be the round of the future. And that is what our discussion for this section of the video will focus on. The book goes through in great detail what the United States is really interested in pursuing. It is the .30 caliber lightweight cartridge. Now, to back this up without belaboring the point too much, the Nazis in World War II had their 8mm short cartridge. The idea behind 8mm short wasn't always fixed in being a intermediate range cartridge that was going to offer very controllable select fire capabilities. A lot of it had to do with Germany's own lack of supplies, like raw materials, and addressing those supplies by realizing that, well, if you're using half as much material per bullet and the bullet can still get you do what you need to with the bullet, you can get twice as many bullets to actually go and get somebody, and that's that's a logistical advantage. And as I understand it, that's where 8K really came from. Only then, of course, it's seen to have serious doctrinal advantage because the sort of trench fighting, mile-long pot shots of World War I are long gone by the time of World War II, where the fighting is much, much closer. Of course, most of the major powers in World War II would find in their own independent studies after the end of World War II that most of the time people were actually able to aim at a particular guy, fire at a particular guy, and hit a particular guy. They were within 100 yards of each other. Anything past that, it would be difficult to tell who of the guys shooting at a particular target were actually the one that hit them. The United States, and I think the United Kingdom would find that you were more likely to hit them with your bullet fragmenting off of something than your bullet itself, much past 100 or 200 yards. And so all of these realizations forced many of the countries to reckon with the fact that maybe we don't need these great big honking full power rifle rounds, and we can step it back at least a little bit. And this is where the development of the .30 lightweight cartridge in the United States come from. This is not to be confused with .30 carbine. It is a completely different thing than .30 carbine. But the initial conception of .30 lightweight in the United States is to get close to the ballistic capability of .30-06, but scaled down to a less long, less heavy, less raw material using cartridge. And originally this is about 2,700 foot per second with a 130 grain projectile, which for those of you who may not be aware, is about 10 to 20% less power, right? So it's a little bit less bullet weight. It's a little bit of a step down from 7.62x51 as we know it today. And that's sort of the initial conception. Now, the .30 light cartridge will end up going through, I believe, like 6 or 7 different serious changes where they're chambering rifles for this cartridge as this cartridge is changing 7 times over. The United States is very, very deeply invested in making a accurate, reliable cartridge that they know is safe, that they know they can reload at safe pressures and get the target ballistics that they want, right? Essentially all of the U.S. Army, not just Springfield Armory, is on board with getting this cartridge to where they want it to be. The problem is their concept is probably flawed from the outset. They were probably targeting a cartridge that was too powerful from the get-go, but this brings us to a separate discussion that we will get to in one second. The point I want to bring up is that from its outset, the United States was interested in making a perfect cartridge. And in fact, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say 7.62x51 was, by the time it was adopted by NATO and then by the United States, probably the most mature, most advanced, most figured out cartridge there was. Because of course 30-06 had problems early on. Practically pick a cartridge, right, had problems early on at this point, especially at the time it was adopted. 7.62x51 was an extremely well-developed cartridge. It's just that in this case, I am going to give credit to the naysayers, right, the people who parrot this idea that 7.62x51 was not the right cartridge for the job. It probably wasn't. However, if we go back and look at the motivations of the Army, more or less single-handedly directed by René Studler, the idea that they had was not dissimilar to what the British had thought, to what the Russians had thought, and to what other major powers had thought. That after World War II, they look at the smorgasbord of small arms that they have at this point and go, "We're using like 6 different calibers. This is stupid. We shouldn't be doing this. Why don't we just have one? Why can't we just have one?" The Russians' one that they settle on is something that they had developed after seeing 8mm short. They saw the Germans have 8mm short, and they thought, that's weird. They had to have done that on purpose. They must have known what they were doing. We should make something like that and see if we can know what we're doing too. And it ended up working out pretty well for them. Of course, that round changed a couple of different times in its development, but by the time it was adopted, it was a fairly mature cartridge that would only go through a few more changes as it was put in a series, like a family of rifles in the SKS and the AK and the RPD there off the bat. The British were interested in, they had developed their own, what was known as 280 British cartridge that was frankly a true intermediate cartridge in terms of muzzle energy, in terms of power. It's sort of a little bit on the upper end of intermediate power, but it was a true intermediate cartridge. The Belgians went to looking at 8mm short, and in fact, that's what the FAL started out in, was they were like, well, this works. We should just use the German cartridge again. And that's sort of where they started out. Meanwhile, the United States approaches this problem by looking at it and going, okay, so we'd like to consolidate everything into one cartridge. The other countries that had done this, right? The United States certainly isn't savvy to what the Soviet Union is doing specifically. I don't know that they're super savvy to what the UK is doing, and FN really isn't a first world. It's not a major power, especially because Belgium was just previously Germany a couple of years ago. But the United States decides that if we're going to have one cartridge to do everything, we shouldn't sacrifice all of our range out to 800 yards, because even though there wasn't a lot of 800-yard shooting going on, it would really suck if, maybe if Russia or China, we weren't concerned about China at this point, but if the adversary of the future, right, is to have rifles that can shoot to 800 yards, what happens if you don't? What happens if you can't? You're screwed, right? You can't do anything about it. So the United States was interested in maintaining that capability to have range, but in their cartridge that they were going to call the lightweight cartridge, which would end up being, by the end of this, right, spoiler alert, it ends up being practically a ballistic twin to 30-06, and it's not a step down in power at all. But they were concerned early on, at least, with not abandoning all of their long-range capability, whereas Russia had practically shit-canned that. 280 British was like 2,400 foot per second muzzle velocity. They had shit-canned their desires to have long-range capability was like gone with such a low initial muzzle velocity. So the United States isn't really willing to give up on that, and that's sort of the story of 7.62x51's initial development. You can cast as many stones as you'd like at that. In retrospect, I think probably the United States should have spent, they end up spending like 4 or 5 years in the actual development of 7.62x51. If they had spent the first year, instead of just assuming at ground fact, 30 cal lightweight, just a little step down from 30-06 is ideal. If they'd instead looked at other things like how low can we go, being sort of a metric that they throw in there at some point, like could we just use 22 caliber stuff? Had they realized that sooner, right, they would have been 20, 30, 40 years ahead of most other countries to that. However, this consideration is not made at the time, and it's just taken as ground truth. What would work well is a 30 caliber cartridge, and that's just because Studler said so, and he's sure of it. And they go and put all this development into it and make 7.62x51 a really, really good cartridge that answers a question that's not really applicable anymore. Certainly it's good for a DMR cartridge, but this cartridge is meant to do it all, and it doesn't do it all nearly as well as other cartridges at the time were capable of doing. And that is perhaps its one largest flaw, is that the United States pays lip service to this idea of we'll have one cartridge to do everything, but they don't design a cartridge that's capable of doing everything. They design a cartridge that's good at long-range engagements and good at DMR sort of things and good at more traditional ideas and not as forward-looking as they could have been. And not to psychoanalyze too much, but if we are to take a peek behind the curtain and think about why they would think this, the United States sort of put on a masterclass in World War II as far as their manufacturing acumen, right? There's multiple of our allies that we bailed out big time, and we were able to do so with the M1 Garand. The M1 Garand was an advanced rifle that the Army took a risk on, and that risk paid off massively because we go through all of World War II not having to develop a better rifle, while every other country in the war is panic developing the entire time, trying to figure out a way to make a better rifle. Meanwhile, we've got it already. Like, we struggle with action freezer stuff. Everybody else is struggling with rifles that want to explode, or rifles that can't feed, are trying to, they're all realizing like, oh wow, the ammunition we've been loading in our bolt action rifles produces such inconsistent gas pressure, we can't make gas operation work in the first place. The US is going, we figured that out already. We figured that out ages ago. We've got this. So the United States had already sort of shown off how far ahead they were, and they take a conservative choice with the 30 caliber lightweight cartridge. They don't go out on a limb to say, well, the ideal cartridge would be one that's totally unlike one that's ever been proven successful before, and they instead defer to, we know this works, maybe we just tweak it a little bit based off of what we learned, it's probably still going to work just fine. And you can fault them for that as much or as little as you think they're due, but I frankly just don't think it was wrong outright of them to settle on 30 lightweight being the cartridge to do. I just think that had they put more thought into it, they probably could have come up with something else. But this is this becomes something that you can have your own opinion on. But I think the facts of the matter show that their opinion is at least pretty defensible. Now, moving on past that point, Of course, there's a lot of twistings that go on with the cartridge. This stack up here shows us, of course, a 30-06 silhouette on the left. Here is a 300 Savage silhouette with a military bullet in it. We then have a 30-06 case taken down to 300 Savage case length. And then finally, that sort of initial 7.62x51. And one thing to pay attention to is the case angle. The shoulder angle there on the case changes constantly. Also, the taper angle on the case body changes multiple times. Again, as they're trying to wring out what actually works best. They do the science, they do the math and the engineering to find what works really well for something that probably wasn't the right step in the right direction. But they definitely step into it and figure it out really well. And again, sort of the interesting caveat thing here is people like to summarize the development of 7.62x51 to say, well, what they set out to do was make 30-06 but short. And that's not entirely true. What they set out to do was take 300 Savage and make a military cartridge out of it. 300 Savage was sort of, traditionally a little bit less powerful than 30-06, and that's sort of what they had based 7.62x51 on, only by the time that they were done developing it, they had sort of pushed 7.62x51, this sort of ideal cartridge they had developed, closer to what its max load capability would be, which puts it back on par with 30-06 in the first place. So they sort of started from 300 Savage, which was less powerful, and then worked their way back up as they made the cartridge better and better, going, well, we can squeeze more power out of it. Why shouldn't we? We can squeeze more power out of it. Why shouldn't we? And now we're 30-06 again. And the light in the cartridge ended up just becoming the actual weight of the loaded ammunition because the case was shorter. In fact, initially using that 130 grain bullet ends up becoming the 147s or 149s or 150s that are familiar to us because the same things were used in 30-06. And here's a couple more silhouettes. I believe these are all prototype 7.62x51 developmental cases and cartridges and bullet loadings and changes to angles and changes to angles and changes to case volume and brass thickness. Again, they developed the shit out of 7.62x51. They were really trying very hard. And of course, with the development of this cartridge, we ended up needing a new rifle for it because they're developing a cartridge in absence of a rifle there initially. Now, the rifle that the United States settles on is the T-25. The T-25 is often left out of the M14 story entirely, and I think that's a mistake because understanding the T-25 or understanding the M14 requires understanding the T-25 first. The T-25 is Rene Studler's baby. He didn't design it. He ended up having someone else design it, but he was always the T-25's biggest fan and biggest supporter. He was convinced that the T-25 was going to be the rifle of the future. He funneled practically all of the small arms development that was going to be going towards light rifle or new rifle development to the T-25. He was convinced this was it. Now, we don't need to go into a full study of what the T-25 is, was, or will be here for this video, but the important thing to understand is that the design motivators for the T-25 was to have inline recoil, which was something that the U.S. had learned from other rifles, but had certainly learned from the FG-42, which is probably evinced best by the fact that this rifle's got sights that are shockingly FG-42 inspired. Additionally, the action on this rifle, not borrowed from the FG-42, is borrowed from the BAR. It's sort of a BAR-style tilting block system. And the entire construction of the rifle is meant to be much simplified compared to the Garand. Now, the reason they would go with a simplified construction is because it's again important to put yourself in the time frame, the mind space of the time. We're here in sort of the late 1945 to 1950 time frame, right? If you're in the military, what's the weapon that is at the forefront of your mind? I'll give you a second to think about it. It's not rifles. It's not airplanes. It's not aircraft carriers anymore. Aircraft carriers are old. Nobody cares anymore. It's not tanks. It's not artillery. The thing that's in the front of your mind is nuclear weapons. The United States drops the sun on Japan twice, and this breaks the mind of military planners, strategists, tacticians, generals. Everybody's mind is completely broken by the fact that this technology now exists. Of course, the United States is the only country that has it, but they only have exclusive control of it for some time. It's not like it's some secret that nobody else is ever going to find out. And so the United States sort of puts a concerted effort into thinking about what warfare in the future looks like if we're going against a foe that's nuclear armed. Of course, the actual negative effects of nuclear weapons, right, the lasting radiation and these sorts of damages were not well understood at this point in time. And it was just conceived that, okay, when we're fighting in the future, we're just going to be nuking each other multiple times a day, right? That's what the war of the future will look like, is just nukes raining from the sky constantly. The actual atrocity that those sort of weapons can wreak on humans wasn't fully understood or fully embraced, fully accounted for. And so it was assumed they'd be used in the next war. So the thing that the United States then wants to prepare for is that, okay, well, if we're going to get nuked, it's probably going to be our industrial centers that get hit hardest. And so we want to have a rifle that can be manufactured without being, outside of state-of-the-art facilities. So we don't need a state-of-the-art facility. A mom-and-pop machine shop can be churning us out parts. And this is a design philosophy that ends up being rolled into a lot of U.S. arms development there in this time frame. So development of the T-25 sort of kicks off from this point. A rifle is made, a rifle ends up being preliminary tests. However, other rifles are also looked at. But it's important to remember that Studler at this point is more or less in control of who gets money to develop these sorts of things. And from the beginning, the T-25 is his favorite. It's the one that he gives the most money to, the most time to, the most attention to. He's convinced that this is the right way to make a rifle. And not a lot of attention is given to the other rifles. And frankly, most of that's fair. The T-28 was another competitor. It sort of used a roller lock piston-operated system, borrowed to some extent from German firearms. I guess you can agonize to your heart's content over which German firearm you want to say it borrowed specific ideas from, but it was certainly Nazi German inspired. The T-28 had parts breakage issues in it. Probably it was probably fair for Studler to say this is not a workable idea and it should go away. Garand himself ends up introducing his own rifle, and this is this bullpup that everybody sort of knows and loves. The first prototype of this rifle ended up having a great big shroud that covered the barrel, and then the gas would be ported off of the barrel through a regular gas port system, and then into this great big shroud, and then this shroud would have a massive piston at the end that would cycle the rifle. The thought here was one of several things. It was that having this great big shroud with gas porting out at the end would reduce the smoke emitted from the firearm, as well as to some extent the noise and the flash. And it's true that the rifle would do this. However, having that great big shroud, which wasn't really vented anywhere, underneath the handguard, again, because it's there to capture smoke, so it can't really be vented. It was found in testing this rifle that after firing 2,000 rounds, the gun would start becoming louder and having more flash, and smoke would start emitting from the rifle. And they realized this because, after 2,000 rounds, the entire inside of this handguard was full of carbon, to the tune of 1 pound of carbon buildup had come underneath this handguard. For reference, I think that works out to 8 grains of carbon you're building up under the handguard every shot, which is a lot. If you consider what the gunpowder load of these cartridges are at the time, you're putting a lot of carbon underneath that handguard every shot. So Garand then redesigns the rifle to end up having a more conventional operating mechanism. However, the bullpup is not ever really given much consideration by Studler, and frankly, again, I don't think that's entirely unfair. This gun is a little bit of a ergonomic situation going on. I don't know where you're supposed to put your face. That's usually with bullpups you've got big length of pull problems, but that almost looks too short and too close to the magazine there with your firing hand. It was certainly an interesting concept, but really didn't make it much farther than that. However, one part of this rifle wound up being very important to the M14 story. It's this guy right here, the magazine at the back. Will end up playing a major role later. Not exactly this magazine in the M14, but this magazine, with a couple of alterations, again made by Garand, will end up becoming the M14's magazine. So a cool little Easter egg there that we'll come back to later. Additionally, there's the T-33. Thing to know about the T-33 is it didn't work. It was actually a really, really cool way that the rifle was held together, like clamshell wood pieces, and the big thought there is that wood was actually one of the hardest parts, one of the biggest problems with the M1 Garand even. There's trials that were done with the Garand that would find that after a couple thousand rounds, Garand's group size will end up increasing somewhere between 30%. Some reports said double, but in the testing that was done in the report that I had read, it was about 30% increase in group size after 2,000 rounds, and the rifles would be bore gauged. They'd be essentially every part of the bore would be gauged. They'd gauge the throat, they'd gauge out at the muzzle, try to find out why these rifles' group size increased. They'd rebarrel these rifles and they'd still shoot loose. They couldn't figure out what it was, and it turns out it's the stock. The stock of the rifle will take a set from the action moving forward backwards in it, and after a couple thousand rounds, the action will become so loose in the stock that shot to shot, where the action actually settles in the stock will affect your accuracy to the point when it's like 2 or 3 minutes of angle of variance you can pick up because of how much your action moves in the stock shot to shot. So this was certainly a known problem, and it is interesting that the T-33 more or less solves that by having a steel receiver that's a straight up tube. This isn't exactly how the AR-10 and AR-15 will solve this later on or do the same thing later on, but it's really, really close to how Stoner's M8 prototype works. All the way down to the lightning holes down through the back of it. That's very early AR-10 had this same exact thing going on there. We'll see later in history. I don't know if the Armalite guys had seen this rifle, but it's not impossible. And frankly, it's kind of a shocking resemblance going on there. And of course, back to the wood, they had clamshelled it here on this rifle because it's no longer a structural element of the rifle and the way it is on the Garand, where here you've sort of got your receivers connected to your stock, is connected to your trigger group, independent of the wood stock itself. But this rifle had issues, ended up being redesigned and moving to I believe still 2-piece, but a more traditional style stock. It's got a really funky side charging handle there that I just dig. I think that's very, very cool. But the rifle had reliability problems, had parts breakage problems, and it just didn't hardly go anywhere. Now, this chapter of the M14 book gets into something that is sort of the beginning of the first thing that we can put our finger on and say that feels like the M14's pulse going on in there. This is the T-35. So while all of this was happening, right, these extra weapons developments, Studler's big fan of the T-25. They're trying out those other prototypes. Garand's prototype, his bullpup, all being tested. However, the idea is floated that, hey, with the M1E series, we found a lot of different ways to make M1 Garands better, or at least different. We shouldn't abandon that now that we've sort of got an idea for what this new cartridge is. We should pick back up where that left off, just with the new cartridge. Studler doesn't like this idea because, again, the Garand was heavy. Studler being involved in ordnance was probably the most privy, the most aware of the M1 Garand's shortcomings, because, of course, beyond just the action freeze problem, the Garand did have parts breakage problems in the war. It had parts compatibility issues in the war. Winchester was like criminally incapable of making an operating rod throughout the war, where there was like some lots of parts. Remington was having like 9 out of every 10 part get rejected. And Winchester's like, we certified these, they work. And Springfield checks them and they're like, no, they don't. These would not be interchangeable with any rifles but your own. And that's a problem because the whole concept behind the M1 Garand was a bunch of different manufacturers making all these parts. The parts could be thrown into a pot for cleaning and then distributed back out to different rifles. And you don't have to match a bolt to a rifle. You don't have to match an op rod to a rifle. The parts just be able to go back and the guns work great. Did it end up working that way? No, not really. But that was the intent, and for the most part, it did work that way, that if you needed a part replaced, you could just get a part, and the armorer wouldn't have to fit the part to your gun. He would just install the part on your gun. Or in some cases, sort of the ultimate realization of this is if you have an extractor fail, the armorer doesn't even have to pop the extractor out of the bolt. He just has a bolt assembly that he puts in your gun, and you're just back in action, right? So that then the time spent doing logistical repairs is even reduced in that regard. And with bolts being a wear item, certainly replacing them isn't bad to do. So these are some of the ideas of replaceable parts that were at least being toyed with there early on. So the T-35 was more or less this first attempt to just take an M1 Garand and make it work with 308. Now, there was many problems with this, not the least of which is, as mentioned, Studler didn't like the Garand much in the first place, and he only had one engineer assigned to working on the Garand from 1947, which was sort of the birth of this light rifle program, to 1952, which is the time that, jumping ahead in history, the T-25 is axed. It ended up being determined non-savable. in the United States' rifle hopes at this point rely on a product-improved Garand at this point. So the T-35 had one engineer working on it from that sort of 1947 timeframe to 1952, and it's Mr. Lloyd Corbett. I won't mention his name much more from now on. I'll just sort of refer to it as the T-35, but I do want to give him honorable mention as being an incredibly hard worker to take the M1 Garand from something that was what it was and maturing it as far as he did, which will be sort of the next series of things we cover. So converting the T-35 to use the new 30 caliber was no easy task. It was not just as simple as swapping the barrel. Of course, because 308 is a shorter cartridge, they had to introduce essentially a blocking plate at the front of the magazine well, the internal magazine well on the Garand. Additionally, they ended up finding that because the taper on the new 308 or the 7.62x51 cartridge was less, they ended up needing more gas power driving the rifle in order to get it to cycle reliably. There was a large series of developments that had taken place trying to chase around the gas port size to find the correct gas port size for a 308. They also agonized over accuracy in the M1 Garand because it turns out that, again, the Garand being the rifle that it is, minor changes to things like how hard the rifle is cycling does change the accuracy potential of the rifle because, as mentioned, the wood will get beat up and take a set from the action lurching around inside of it, and this starts to mess with things. So all sorts of gas port sizes were played around with. Eventually, though, this rifle ends up becoming the proving point, right? This is the ground zero, if you will, for how do we make a 308 Garand-based rifle work. Now, as an honorable mention there, just because I think it is worth mentioning, the broader army was somewhat hesitant on the idea of adopting, or you're throwing their support behind the adoption of the 30 light cartridge at this point in time. Still, again, we're like really late 40s, early 50s still for some of this time. And the Army recognizes that it's probably not going to be a good idea to have this 30 light cartridge and 30-06 serve side by side, especially because you can get this 30 light to chamber in some 30-06 guns, only it will blow up if you then fire it. So that's not ideal. And so Springfield is put to task taking the other existing 30-06 firearms and seeing if they can work in 308. So there were 308 BARs. There were also 308 1919s that came about as a result of this experiment. Additionally, during this experimentation, right, I'd mentioned that the British 280 cartridge, they had went and chambered some Garands for the UK 280, the 280 Brit cartridge. However, back to our 7.62x51 Garands, and of course, I do want to clarify. I will sometimes say 308 on accident. I will try and say 7.62x51 as often as I can. However, it's not until the end of 7.62x51's development that it's actually 7.62x51. Prior to that time, it had different case links that they were also experimenting with. So I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but here's that disclaimer now, is that I will refer to it as that because that's what it ended up being, but it did not start that way, and it certainly wasn't that way the entire time during its development. However, there on those 7.62x51 Garands, they had feeding problems. Again, as mentioned, not only did the taper mess with extraction, but the taper messed with feeding as well, because that little bit less taper meant that the rounds were a little bit more tight inside of their on-block clips. So doubly important for why they had to be gassed a little bit harder there. Additionally, as a result of their having to be gassed harder, extraction and ejection got more violent, and as a result of that, left-handed shooters that were shooting Garands would have case ejections just straight into their face. Regularly, the Garand sort of ejects at a top-high angle backwards. However, with the guns being gassed harder, they would just sort of eject, relative to looking straight down the rifle, it'd be at the 1 o'clock position, but straight back towards the shooter. Looking down at the rifle, I suppose that would be more like a 5 o'clock position. So at your 5 o'clock, looking down at the rifle, but looking along the rifle's sights at the 1 o'clock position, it would not be a great place to be a left-handed person. And in fact, if you shoot some 308 converted Garands, they will run this way. It will tend to eject into your face as a left-handed shooter, which is unfortunate. And if the case mouth catches you, it will cut your forehead. So that was certainly another concern they were at least relatively aware of there. Now, as far as injury to shooters, potential risk shooters, the U.S. also put M1 Garands in the 280 British cartridge. The whole time that the Brits were developing 280 British, they were very open in sharing with the United States. Meanwhile, the United States treated the development of 7.62 by 51 as though it were a state secret. We were not forthcoming with the British at all about what the hell we were doing. The British wouldn't stop talking to Springfield about what they were doing, sending us ammo, sending us technical notes, sending us meeting minutes, sending us every step of everything that they were doing, they were telling us about. And for the most part, Studler was ignoring them or stonewalling them. And whenever they asked for what we were doing, they wouldn't get an answer. Some British officers would surmise that there was a growing communist sentiment in the United Kingdom at this time. For a while there, Churchill stopped being prime minister, right? Prime minister during World War II, and then he comes back to be prime minister later. But there is probably some political reasoning for why the United States didn't want to be friends with the United Kingdom, because there was a legitimate concern in the US and even in the UK that the UK was going to align with the Red Soviets. And of course, you're not going to want to tell the guys who are about to go and team switch what your secret sneak attack plan is, right? Well, your secret, this is what we're working on. This is the new stuff. So there's a little bit of a caginess from the United States towards the United Kingdom there, even though the United Kingdom is trying to do their best to show good faith and the fact that they're not communists because they're making a round that has an inch mark after it. We'll ignore the 7 by 43 millimeters. That's not a real thing. 280 British, right? An inch. They're the good guys, not the metric bad guys. Anyway, silly jokes aside, with the 280 British Garands, they had to open the gas port up sort of ridiculously huge to over an eighth of an inch, right? A 150-inch gas port. Because of how the Garand's gas system, as I mentioned earlier, works, the gas block is not press fit to the barrel, and because of that, a little bit of gas leakage usually happens. With as big as the gas port was on 280 British, it would fire embers, hot gas, and unburnt powder debris into the shooter's hand. There would be so much, the support hand that you'd have out there on the front of the rifle would get peppered by stuff that was being ejected between the gas block and the barrel. But then also, as the piston, the operating rod comes to retract, there would also be a blast of material that came out after that. So the United States was not loving the fact that 280 sort of shot you in the hand as you were trying to use it. The book goes into a little bit of a discussion here about integral magazine Garands. And I don't want to go into necessarily a bunch of detail other than to say, yeah, they put a Johnson magazine on an M1 Garand mock-up. That is pretty cool. But the things that they were doing here is that the Army at large was still not sold on the idea, even post-World War II, of every soldier having a magazine rifle. Their reasons for this were pretty clear. They had done simulated combat trials with magazine rifles compared to the Garand, and the conclusion was that the Garand does just as good as them, only it doesn't have the logistical issues of magazines. Because, of course, if magazines don't give you a benefit that you can demonstrate in combat, they are actually just a liability compared to something like the Garand's clip system, because Garand clips could be supplied loaded, right? So the ammunition that you unpackage is just the very simple, cheap clips that are effectively disposable, and that's just your ammo, right? You put that on your bandoliers and in your kit, and then you put those into the rifle and you shoot them, and you shouldn't have to worry about stuffing clips back full of rounds at any point. So the logistical issues of having a clip rifle are less strenuous on both the country and then the warfighter than having magazines to keep up with. So magazines weren't showing an increase in combat effectiveness in simulated combat trials, so they weren't really that interested in having a magazine rifle. However, there were limitations to the Garand system that they did notice. And this is going to be an interesting one, because if you've ever played a video game that had the M1 Garand in it, you've done this, and you've demonstrated the things that the U.S. Army noticed. Traditionally, whenever soldiers would shoot more than 5 rounds from their Garand, they would not stop to reload it by pulling the bolt back and hitting the clip release. They just fire the last 3 rounds at nothing to get the clip to pop out, because it's faster to reload the rifle by pop, 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 and then putting in your new clip than it is to get the bolt back and then hit your clip release and then get your clip and your 3 rounds and sort of try and secure those and then get a new clip in the gun and then get back in the action. So the Army had noticed this and realized that that's kind of a liability, because we're just having guys pop off rounds, and shooting in general is not good if you're not shooting at someone, because A, it wastes ammo, but B, it tends to give away your position, and there's generally just no good reason to be shooting at nothing to save yourself a little bit of time on a reload, right? That's a software hack to a hardware problem, if you will. So the Army was interested in a magazine that could be topped off. Of course, the first thing that came to their mind was the Johnson rifle, because it sort of offers you that same thing, being a rotary magazine where you can just put new rounds into the magazine at any time, even when the bolt is closed. Because, of course, it's technically possible to top off a Garand, but you have to take the bolt back, and it's kind of a messy, a sticky situation. Even to try and single load a Garand with the clip in the action is a little bit of a sticky situation. So the Army was interested in experimenting with larger capacity fixed magazine top offable Garands, because in their simulated combat trials, the Garand was still a top performing rifle. It's just that here's the one thing they would fix is make it easier to reload on the fly, because they were tired of guys doing the video game thing that I know you've done it. You can say in the comments if you've done it, because I do it in video games. And then I was sitting here reading this going, oh my God, this is like the greatest lessons of human factors engineering. In fact, they should probably teach us in human factors engineering if it doesn't even have anything to do with school, right? Where if you make doing things the right way take longer, substantially longer than doing things doing things the quick way, right? The quick and dirty way that you're not supposed to be doing. If you make that so much easier than doing things the right way, people aren't going to do it the right way, and that's just how it works. So being able to design that out would be optimal. And so there's a little lesson in human factors engineering that went on there. In the end, I don't know that there was ever a working example of this rifle. There was at least a prototype mock-up here. There was a lot of parts that would have to be changed on the Garand. That said, most of the changes would be simplifications, because most of the complexity of the Garand was making it work with that funky clip system in the first place. But nonetheless, it would more or less be a complete new rifle, new receiver, new bolt, new all sorts of parts. A little footnote we'll have here is Garand's T20. The T20, for those, I guess, those that want to learn more, you can go ahead and read in the book itself if you would like to. But the T20 was Garand sort of taking his mag-fed Garand, again going back to 30-06 with the stretched receiver, taking that and putting a heavy barrel on it and trying to see if it would be a BAR replacement. The answer was yes, I guess, from the Army. In trials, it would do the things the BAR would do, but it tended to do sort of the things the BAR was most intended to do, a little bit worse than the BAR. Although it was found to be more accurate, which makes sense, what with the BAR being an open bolt. Okay, and with that, I think we're pretty much done with our exposition. That was a lot of material, and so what I want to do is just do a quick hitting the highlights of the things that we had just discussed. Of course, we're familiar with what the Garand is. We're familiar with what the T25 is. We're going to end up learning about a couple more rifles here, but we're also familiar about cartridges. We've heard about the 280, a little familiar with it, roughly familiar with its ballistics. We're familiar with a 30 caliber light rifle cartridge, which is the 7.62x51 here by the end of things. Additionally, we've learned that the Army doesn't really know what the Army wants at this point. Big Army isn't sure if magazine rifles are the right direction or not. It seems like Springfield, again looking to the future, is wanting to push a magazine rifle as hard as it can. It's also wanting to push this, their new cartridge. However, they've got these ideas about the rifle needing to be select fire because that way it will be good at replacing the BAR. Because these ideas about, again, consolidating not only the cartridges you have, but the rifles you have into just one rifle is a very attractive idea. Many different countries look at this. Russia ends up doing this sort of on accident because the RPD is replaced by the RPK, and they end up having a family of AKs, but they did that on accident. Russia didn't intend to do that from the outset of things. The United States was interested, if it could do that, to do that from the very beginning. However, again, they picked a cartridge that just wasn't suitable to do most of those things. Just wasn't suitable for automatic fire, except off of a bipod, and even then with an asterisk, because it's a little bit of a wild ride. Because full power cartridge in a rifle that weighs 8 pounds, cycling 800 rounds per minute, even off of a bipod, it's going to be something that you're going to have to hold on tight to, and you're not going to see much of what you're shooting at the whole time the trigger's held down. Compared to the BAR anyway, which cycles a lot slower and weighs about twice as much. This sort of brings us to the first trials, the first actual rubber meeting the road of these ideas. The 1950 rifles trials is sort of the first time these things are really getting thrown into the ring against each other. Sort of the political background is important to bring into the picture now. I want to avoid the broader political background discussions as much as I can because it's a thing where it's easy to have speculation blend with fact. So I will just try and stick to the things that are more fact than they are speculation. The various countries that were sort of now NATO at this point, right, our budding NATO countries, realized that probably the biggest failure of the Allied forces in World War II, which were otherwise very successful, is that when it came to logistics and supply issues, we couldn't share ammo because not all of us were using the same ammo. This would be something that NATO would talk about multiple different times. Then the whole idea of, well, having a standard cartridge means you can always use your buddy's ammo if worse comes to worse. That doesn't actually work out because they'll agree to a cartridge and they'll agree to like basic things like pressure specs. They'll sometimes even agree to things like how hard brass should be and specs about primers and primer pressures as well. But they won't end up talking much about powder or pressure curves. And this will lead to, throughout the history of NATO's sort of two main service rifle cartridges since its first, right? We've had 7.62 by 51 and then 5.56 by 45. Various different NATO countries make that stuff very differently. And it's not infrequent that a country's particular domestic manufacturer ammo really only works reliably in their guns because that's the ammo that they test. And if you were to take it and put it in somebody else's gun, it's just not going to work very well. This story doesn't really, this anecdote doesn't really plug in much with the M14 in its developmental history, of course, because NATO hasn't even adopted 7.62 by 51 at this point in our story. However, I just want to throw out there that the notion that saying you're going to use the same cartridge means your ammo is interchangeable, it's not a fact that you can just take at face value. It's not doesn't work that way just because you say it's going to work that way. So there's something, there's a lesson to be learned there, one way or the other. Now, the same should probably also be true about a rifle, because the individual things, like even if you got in a fantasy situation where you got all of the countries in NATO or in an alliance to say, this is the rifle we want, this is the rifle we're going to use, they're all going to want different things out of that rifle. For example, Canada is going to want cold weather performance out of the rifle more so than Spain is going to want cold weather performance out of the rifle. So you've got sort of competing interests when it comes to the features that should actually be on the rifles that they're actually going to be using. So consensus is a little bit of a nasty word, right? It's dirty business when it comes to the political dealings of trying to standardize. That standardization should have consensus, but what consensus means is you'll never actually have consensus. It's just not going to happen because it's not feasible, right? And forcing that consensus is really not going to work, right? Like if everybody was forced to make ammo the exact same, probably that could be pulled off. It would just take the countries that weren't the U.S. a long time to do it because the U.S. would get its way because the U.S. always gets its way, and everybody else would be left trying to catch up with whatever specification the U.S. puts down as far as burn rates for powders and these sorts of things. It would be really, really tricky to shove this rifle in this configuration down everybody's throats because it would end up weighing like 12 pounds in order for it to have all of the features that all of the countries mutually agree are the things that they need. So that little discussion aside, right, that's my general feelings on the whole standardization discussions that end up recurring multiple times throughout the rest of this discussion. Though that's sort of what the 1950s trials segues in with, is that the 1950s trials was meant to be the United States looking at a potential successor to the M1 Garand, but then also in the fine print as a successor to the grease gun, a successor to the Thompson, to the extent that the grease gun hadn't already replaced the Thompson, successor to the BAR, right? It was going to succeed, ideally, all of our small arms in one, was the hope in the fine print, but at the very least, it's going to be replacing the Garand. So again, Studler's T25 is going to be there, right? That's his front runner. That's what he thinks the future of America rides on. There's two other major contenders at this point. The UK is going to show up with their EM2 bullpup rifle. The important thing to know about the EM2 bullpup rifle is in every trials report that you'll read about it, you'll read about the parts that broke on it. It breaks parts constantly. It only ever really does one thing in trials right, and we'll talk about that later because it's worth mentioning, but the EM2 is more or less plagued with issues its entire time. The other sort of competitor there is the FAL. This is FN's designed rifle. It's not actually called FN or FAL at this time. It's just the FN automatic rifle or the FN rifle. They have not sort of given it the FN designation quite at this point yet, but I will continue to refer to it as the FAL because that's sort of the rifle we know it as today. The FAL, at this point in history, is a relatively immature rifle, and it's coming out of FN, and while we know FN today, and Browning knows FN, and it's familiar to us because of that, FN at this point had spent, as far as manufactured military arms that the U.S. government cared about, FN had spent more time being a German arms factory than it had been a Belgian arms factory. So the United States was right to be at least a little wary of these like chocolate manufacturing French people who are like, look, we can make rifles too. But nonetheless, the British are very enthusiastic about the FAL as well. And so the FAL is brought along for testing here in 1950. And before we go and sort of get into the actual details of these tests, the sort of things that I want to hit on is sort of a key lesson. And again, it's that the British had designed 280, and they had convinced the Belgians to make the FAL in 280 as sort of one of these, hey, this way, our cartridge has a better chance of succeeding and your rifle has a better chance of succeeding. Because the British thought they had a really good cartridge. And I'm not going to say 280 British was good because it was just too low velocity. And even after they increased the velocity, it was probably still too low velocity for what it needed to do. But they at least by that point, they were getting close to the velocities offered by 7.62 by 39, which was good. But it's frankly just a little bit low on velocity. But the British liked their cartridge. The Belgians, of course, liked their rifle because it's that or chocolate. And so they were both proud about these. So they sort of agreed to work together on that in that regard. And this leaves FN, the UK, and the US as sort of being the three powerhouses, like they're the three countries that have something to offer in small arms development at this point. Other countries are sort of working on stuff on the back burner, but there's nothing that's really going to feature in this story like the rifles from these three countries. Now, the other thing that I want to make clear here is that, again, we're going to dive into the political, and I'm going to try and avoid the speculative side of it, but we have to touch on another political question, and that's adopting a rifle that wasn't designed by your country. Now, people tell the M14 story as the United States was super, super hostile to the foreign gun because America has to win, and patriotism and jingoism and red, white, and blue, wood and steel. And I want to stress the fact that certainly as like a second or third string item, that is something that weighs on everyone's conscience. However, the Army aren't a bunch of like jerk-off comic book bad guys that are like, America, I'm a cartoon caricature of Uncle Sam. America must win. Capitalism, free market burger, hot dog hamburger. That's not really how the Army is approaching this at all. The Army is interested in finding the best rifle for their soldiers. Even though we have some concerns about Britain being communist at some point in the future, it's not like they're not our allies, and we're interested to see what is the best rifle. However, regardless of what country it is, if it's the US, if it's the UK, if it's Belgium, if it's Germany at this point, if it's Spain at this point, if it's Russia at this point, because Russia, when looking at its post-World War II firearms, did look at other countries' offerings. The big thing that you have to deal with when you look at a foreign designed gun is this. By the nature of how a domestic manufactured firearm works, you already have the manufacturing base and manufacturing capability to make it because it's domestic. You already made it. That's why it exists. Meanwhile, a foreign designed arm, that's not always the case. This is probably best illustrated with the AR-15, where it was attractive to the United States, where it wasn't attractive to other countries, because the United States had an aluminum forging industry. If you didn't have an aerospace industry, especially if you didn't have a rocket program in the 1950s and 60s, you didn't have an aluminum forging industry. That just was, you couldn't get aluminum forgings in most countries on Earth, especially at that point in time. And even still to this day, there's countries that just don't do aluminum forgings. You can't get them made. If you are a first world country, a first world military power, right, a leading world power, You will not accept a rifle that you can't make yourself. You have to be able to make it yourself if you want to be a major player. Just how it works, right? So, if you're the United States or any country that's looking at developing or adopting a foreign-made rifle, part of the whole calculus that goes on in adopting the rifle has to be, can we make this? How hard is it going to be to make this? How long is it going to take us to make this? Is our country even used to making something like this? And this is especially relevant to the FAL, not just because the FAL was designed in millimeters, which is a different unit of measurement, but because all of the FAL's engineering and mechanical drawings were not written or drawn up in a way that the United States engineering community could understand. There's the debate about, or I guess the fact about the first and third angle projection drawings. So the actual way that the 2D parts were drawn out for the FAL were drawn differently than how we would do things in the US. I won't go into extreme detail on that, but the United States is at least aware of the fact that any gun that's designed by a metric European country is going to have designed it wrong with the wrong units, and they drew the parts wrong, and all of their dimensioning and tolerancing callouts and sorts of things are not going to be compatible with the way we make things here in America. All of this to say, regardless of what country is looking at adopting a rifle, you're going to have to take into consideration the fact that if you don't know how to make it currently, it will take you years to learn how to make this rifle. And that's not years learning how to make the rifle reliable. That's years learning how to make the rifle at all in its primordial, unreliable state before you can make it more reliable in your domestic manufacture. This is a massive hurdle. It's difficult to say that I'm not going to say that the FAL never had a chance because of this, because it absolutely did. And in fact, the Army was bizarrely close to just throwing in the towel early and saying the FAL wins, we should get the FAL. But the important thing to remember is that it's an uphill battle the whole time for the rifle that's not domestic designed and not domestic manufactured. Because it's not domestic designed, because it's not domestic manufactured. Americans design things the American way to be made on American tools. That's not a jingoism thing, that's not a patriotism thing, that's a practicality thing. It's not like we're like, oh, look at us, we're so progressive and worldly, we're a real globalist country because we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot by making sure that we won't be able to have new rifles for 5 years because we're busy trying to figure out what the fuck a millimeter is. The United States isn't really interested in spending that time and effort if the FAL isn't already a markedly superior rifle. So, if it's markedly superior, then you undertake the analysis of, is this worth it in the first place, right? Is it superior enough that it's worth the pain and effort that it's going to be going through, essentially redesigning the rifle from scratch so you could make it on your manufacturing equipment to your manufacturing standards that you spent all of the 1920s and 30s developing on your own without any of the standardization. Okay, little mini rant aside there, we are ready to look at the actual results of those trials. And we will return to our FAL book for that. We won't go through every single one of these tests, but sort of the highlight of these tests, the key thing to pay attention to is that when it comes to foreign object infiltration, so dust tests, mud tests, cold and dry tests to some extent, because water vapor will infiltrate the gun as well, the EM2 is hands down the front runner, mostly because it's a completely sealed system, right? That's pretty much what it comes down to. However, the EM2 was noted as having parts break. It can't really fire rifle grenades without breaking parts. It's bad in seawater, bad when it comes to corrosion. Got all sorts of problems there. The FAL is noted as having very easy to disassemble. It held up great with corrosion testing. Its flash hider did a really good job, but also its flash hider is gigantic if you've ever seen an FAL flash hider, so that's sort of like cheating. However, the FAL in 280 has horrible accuracy problems in the 1950 trials. I believe in the 1950 trials, they try and chalk this up to the ammunition being bad, and the British go and rush and scramble to go and design a different 280 cartridge. Previously, they had put a steel core in it, probably to try and drive more of the mass to the rear to increase their ballistic coefficient so that they could have the limited velocity they had in the first place hold on a little bit better at longer range. However, this caused all sorts of accuracy issues with the rifle, and even after they corrected it and just made pure lead core ammunition, it still had horrid accuracy problems. Not quite horrid, but it ended up shooting much wider groups than the T-25 or even the EM2 did. Additionally, and this is a little bit of a forewarning, even in the 1950s trials, the FAL had big problems in the cold. It just did not want to work very well at all in the cold. When it came to the T-25, the tests that it did best in was the rain test, which of course mattered a lot to the United States because the Garand had all sorts of trouble in the rain tests. Elevation tests, which you may think is like shooting it like on a mountain versus at sea level. It's not what the elevation test is. The elevation test is pointing the gun 80 degrees straight up and pointing the gun 80 degrees up in the air, 90 degrees down at the ground, and seeing how it cycles for reliability pointed up or down. Both the EM2 and the FAL have more problems than the T-25 in this test. The T-25 ends up proving to be the most accurate in semi-auto fire. It has the best seawater immersion performance. And the things that it does the worst at is the foreign object infiltration. It's because the T-25 is not a sealed system, right? Mud, dust, and debris can get inside of the operating parts, inside of the action very easily. And there is a lot of contact between the bolt and the receiver and the upper cover on the rifle to let these things rub together. This is something that the FAL will end up running into a lot more later on. Now, another thing that these trials were set out to do was to determine the actual effectiveness of the cartridges being compared, because of course they're comparing accuracy and reliability between guns of disparate cartridges. And you can look at this as being an unfair comparison, or you can look at this as being the best shake that the EM2 was ever going to get, because the EM2 being adapted to 308 would be tricky and end up proving to be not worth its while, because the EM2 was more or less shit-canned by the time that was a realistic consideration in the first place anyway. But it's probably also the best chance the FAL has, because the FAL has had more development as a 280 rifle than it has as anything else at this point in time. But it's probably a more fair comparison than people want to give it credit for. However, this was also a comparison of the calibers, and the results were pretty clear. The 308 was a more accurate caliber. It tended to be a somewhat more reliable caliber. Of course, we're again comparing a couple of guns, a couple of T-25s using the caliber against the guns using the 280. But the United States ended up using this test to more or less confirm its assumption that the 7.62x51 cartridge was the correct cartridge for them to go ahead with. It was, it performed superior in these trials, in their opinion, in this T-25 to the 280 did and its two sort of host guns. And they used this as sort of that core justification that their cartridge was right. Was this a correct thing for them to do? Probably not. They probably should have tested 280 some more and tried to figure out why 280 was so inaccurate. However, Studler is... I'm not going to say he's the one calling these shots, because he isn't. But Studler does have a finger on the scale as far as things are concerned here, right? His word does carry a lot of weight, and he's here saying, look, it's this simple. 280, if 280 can be fixed, it's because it's not a developed cartridge yet. The 30 caliber light cartridge is a developed cartridge. We've got it here right now. Why would we mess with a good thing? Why don't we adopt the devil? We do, if that's how you have to look at it. And that's sort of the direction that the United States goes in from then on. Now, back over here in our FAL book, I will just scroll through the test data real quick, because I don't know that I've seen this published any other places, and that is one thing that I wish was more available, is more of the published test data. But just to flip through that real quick, you can see that there was all sorts of different tests, as well as notes sort of regarding what had happened. And it's important to understand that these trials were between two examples of each rifle, and with the production numbers of each of these rifles at this point in history, the sample size of rifles that you're dealing with is pretty much all handmade prototype level development rifles that you're dealing with here in this particular instance. So you shouldn't take everything you see here as being ground truth, because these rifles are still very young. This is just a trial that was done early enough to sort of give you a gut check on, are any of these rifles going to be absolute shit cans? And the writing was at least on the wall for the EM2 with its parts breakages, which would end up being something that never really truly got resolved. All right, and then we're here with that summary table, which is what I had more or less just paraphrased earlier. And the T-25 becomes the only rifle to complete the cook-off test, but that's because the T-25 has when set to full auto, it's an open bolt system, and the cook-off test is, of course, done in full auto for rifles that are so capable, and all of these rifles were. And so, of course, the T-25 is going to win that because it's an open bolt. You can just keep cramming rounds to it. It's not going to start really cooking off because it's an open bolt. So people will point to this as being like, well, the U.S. rigged the test. However, cook-off test was something that had been done by, this was a standard test that the U.S. did for its infantry rifles, right? That Garand went through cook-off testing as well way back in the day. So it's not like they invented this test to make sure that the T-25 won something hands down. It's just that these, the EM2 and the FAL did not pay particular consideration to avoiding cook-off after extended firing. The T-25 went out of its way to do this. Now, that said, back in the U.S., within the Army itself, the overall impression that people got from these trials was that FN rifle did a good job. That FN rifle did a good job. The United States' impression of the FN rifle changed pretty substantially from, wow, the chocolate people made a gun, to, who did you say this guy's name was that had designed this? Same guy who designed the high power, curiously enough. But the United States is suddenly very interested in the FAL, and Studler doesn't like this. And so, Studler's reaction to these trials is that the FAL should be, the T-25 should be reworked. All of the things that were wrong in the test should be addressed. Everything should be, buffed up, improved, because, again, there will be more trials, right? Like, as I'd mentioned, this 1950s trials was the first time the United States was looking at foreign guns since the 1920s. However, this was not going to be like we're adopting one of these at the end of this trial. This was still a very preliminary sort of investigation. By the time that the official Army report about all of these tests are available, Studler sort of finds himself in a situation where it seems like the Army is a little bit too friendly with the FAL for his liking. So he realizes that if in the event that the T-25 can't be saved, what he needs to do is hedge his bets. He's aware of the fact that he's had one engineer working on improved 308 Garands this entire time, and so he diverts a little bit of funding away from the T-25 and towards these Garands, right? So it's not quite there in 1950, but 2 years later, that program will have more than one engineer working on it, but that engineer now at least has money to do tests, to get rifles built, to get machine shop prototypes put together, and to go and take them to a test range and shoot the crap out of them to see what does work and what doesn't work. Whereas up to this point, this guy was working on a shoestring budget with the improved Garand experimentation. So Studler does at least have a little bit of a confidence crisis that starts as just a little kernel of, well, it seems like the Army likes the FAL, and he realizes, well, maybe the T-25 isn't as good as I thought, and so maybe we should work on this other stuff just a little bit too, right? Just to have it in reserve, just in case. And so the designer of the T-25, a Mr. Harvey, was convinced, even after the fact, he had been interviewed by Ed Ezel, who was another famous arms researcher. Ed Ezel had sat down with Mr. Harvey, and Mr. Harvey's opinion was that if he had kept sufficient funds and development and attention, and in fact had more funds made available to him than he had in the first place on the T-25, he felt that he could have made the T-25 into a finished working product. And that would be an interesting timeline to see, where the U.S. adopts a stamped sheet metal BAR-ish simplified light rifle of sorts. I certainly would like to have had that rifle be more popular. Why is it that we have Mini 14s as the FUD rifle instead of the T-25/T-47? I would prefer the funky BAR thing instead. Now, as a part of the T-25's improvements, it ends up getting more or less redesigned, reworked, and it has, what was done with the M1 Garand begins to be done with the T-25, where they go and look through the entire design, and they work over the design so that they can get closer to guaranteeing that every part of the rifle could be an interchangeable part. This is, these days known as like tolerance allowance. People sort of like anachronistically refer to it as tolerance stacking. It's not like taking into account tolerance stack is a part of tolerance allocation, but what they're really doing here is making sure that the rifle can be made as a replaceable parts rifle, making sure there's not as much hand fitting required, as well as working in design improvements to sort of address the issues that had shown up in the T-25. Because the next set of trials that are going to happen, they're going to want to see the rifles not just improve in performance, but improve in the maturity of the designs. Rifles that have to be slavishly hand fit together aren't going to be things that you can end up going forward with and adopting. So they need to end up seeing that the rifles can move out of the prototype phase and maybe a little bit more towards the light of low-rate initial production. And that's sort of the situation that the now T-47 finds itself in. However, come 1951, one small wrench is thrown into the works about all this. The Korean War kicks off, and the United States ends up doing more orders of new production M1 Garand rifles during this time. Springfield Armory, Harrington Richardson, and International Harvester end up getting contracts to manufacture more of these rifles. And between 1953 and 1957, they end up building 1.4 million new Garands. These, and again, all post-World War II rifles here. This is the Korean War production time. Putting the Garand back into production and seeing it stretch its legs in another war ended up inspiring some in the Army to go ahead and give this budding 308 Garand idea a little bit more legitimacy, where previously most people had felt, okay, we're ready to move past the Garand. The Garand service in Korea, while certainly not stellar, right? In fact, the Garand going up against the Soviet weaponry at the time really sort of laid bare how the Garand had, U.S. had been caught up in terms of arms development at this point and caught up by our enemies, and that's really not a situation you want to find yourself in. So the United States had realized it was probably time to, after this whole little war that they're having, that they do need to find a new rifle. But the Garand coming back to the plate, and while not doing perfect, doing an acceptable job, really reminds the United States that, hey, the Garand wasn't bad, even if it did have issues. It was certainly redeemable. And so more interest is then given yet to the production of the 308 Garand designs. It's important to note that, especially with the Korean War kicking off, development of new rifles, while it was understood to be important, ends up having money siphoned away from it because the nature of warfare is still very much in this budding atomic age. The development of nuclear bombs and nuclear missiles, as well as new fighting aircraft, sort of takes priority when it comes to Defense Department spending. They're not as interested in finding a new wonder rifle as they are in, well, if we actually get into a real war, because Korea is just a little bitty baby war, if we actually get into a big war, the thing that we're going to have to watch out for is we're going to be nuking the crap out of each other, and we want to be able to nuke people more so than shoot them with our little bitty pop guns. And this is sort of the prevailing theory of how, again, this is how everybody thinks wars are going to be fought, and they are not nearly as concerned about finding a better small arm when it's the biggest of the big arms that's sort of at the front of everyone's mind. Meanwhile, back on the rifle development front, the T-47, which at this point had been more or less reworked, thought out again, redesigned, was having the same problems that the T-25 have. This ends up causing the little bit of a confidence crisis that Studler had a kernel of before to really get bent out of shape, right? It becomes a very massive issue for him that the rifle that he's couched all of his reputation in and his ego in at this point is coming up short. And at this point, he ends up deciding that the T-47 probably can't be redeemed, at least not redeemed in time. And he starts pulling more and more support away from the T-47 and pushing that support towards the sort of improved M1E series rifles, right? These M1 Garand redesigned rifles that are going to be in 7.62x51. Now, Harvey, the designer of the T-47, as I'd mentioned, sort of objects to this. He felt that if he had kept that support, he could have solved the rifle. However, in Studler's mind, he's aware of the fact that during World War II, the Springfield Armory has spent a lot of money trying to design improved Garands. He now sits here and realizes we can take all of the best parts of those lessons, put them into a new production Garand-esque rifle that's in 308, and the concept at this point is we can more or less be using the Garand's system with a couple of tweaks that we know will make it better. And this will give us a rifle that we know we can manufacture practically every part of very easily, right? We know we can make them interchangeable. And the end result of this will be our rifle will then be further ahead of what everybody else is doing worldwide. And this will sort of springboard us into saying, look, we've got a complete rifle. You should adopt our complete rifle as opposed to everybody else's incomplete rifle. And this is sort of the thought, is that you could save yourself a lot of time of the T-47's not a complete rifle compared to an M1 Garand++, if you will, is much closer to being a complete rifle than anything else that's been shown off thus far. Now, this brings us to the trials of 1952. These trials were sort of the make it or break it trials, where there was supposed to be a down selection, right? There was supposed to be fewer rifles overall at the end of the trials. The rifles that didn't seem worthy of further development were to be parsed out. The rifles that were worthy of further development were supposed to be advanced, be pushed forwards. Here we go. And again, for clarity's sake, by this point, T-44 is that improved Garand rifle program at this point. The T-44s that are tested here are using receivers from Garand's T-20 heavy barrel prototype that we'd seen before. So it's a T-20 receiver set up for 308 with the magazine well shrinking block installed while using 308 magazines. And at this point, the 308 magazines are the ones that have been being used in the T-47 and the T-25, which are already known to be bad magazines. So it's a rifle that has like a feed plug and an obviously modified receiver to let it work in the first place. So it is very obvious the T-44 is a kludge, right? It's there as like a pre-prototype even, where when your rifle doesn't even have its own receiver and you have to like modify an existing receiver to make it work, what that means is you're still like slapping stuff together. So it's certainly obvious the T-44 at this point is the least developed rifle there. And it's going against the T-47, which is, again, the product improved T-25. The M1 refers to the M1 Garand, which is included there as sort of a placeholder, right? It's there as a control, really more so than a placeholder. FN represents, of course, the FAL, and EM2 is everybody's favorite friend. Now, what's different about these trials, though, is that FN is certainly trying to land favor with the United States. FN has made the FAL this time around in 308. Additionally, the EM2 is also present in 308, but the EM2 had developmental funding pulled before these trials had actually come to take place. The EM2 was a dead man walking before these trials even started, and so it was really just here at this point to get rejected, which is unfortunate because it is a cool rifle, but it was probably smart of Churchill to read the writing on the wall that the EM2 just wasn't the right direction to head in. And we can go ahead and flip through and look at some of the testing results here, because the results from the 1952 test are a little bit more interesting than the 1950 test because the rifles are at least ostensibly a little bit more mature. So we can go ahead and flip through a little bit of the trials reports here from the 1952 test. One interesting thing, right, this board conclusion is actually pretty important to pay attention to here. That one thing they noticed is that part of the emphasis here was to make a lighter rifle than the Garand, right? Because that was probably the one big consistent criticism of the Garand that you can't just like brush aside, is that the Garand was a heavy rifle. All of the other options were lighter rifles, but by the time you loaded somebody down with a full combat load of ammunition, everybody having about the same amount of ammo, the weight differences here suddenly tip pretty close in the M1's favor, with only the T-44 coming out a little bit lighter. And of course the T-44 is basically an M1, just that takes magazines and is select fire at this point. So this is something that the Army pays close attention to, is that their attempt to save weight and have the soldier carry more stuff means that the M1 is actually going to be the more weight efficient rifle by the time someone's loaded down, because magazines are so much heavier than clips, especially the heavy steel magazines that all of these rifles are utilizing at this point. So very important consideration. A little bit of accuracy testing here. Barrel life testing was done. I don't believe that this book contains the full version of all of these tests, but it does include a summary. Yeah, down here at the end is the summary, if you do want to go through and read it. Pretty much, right, the long story short of what these trials actually found is that the FAL is the clear front runner. The FAL performs the best of all of the rifles in the trials. And this is something that the Army more or less expected, right? The Army was already in favor of the FAL, right? The report from the 1950s trials had also pointed to, hey, what about the FAL rifle, right? They were already pretty enthusiastic about it. So if we're to sort of compare the relative order that the rifles performed in, we see that the FAL performed best, but in most cases, the T-47, the rifle that Studler was afraid wouldn't perform well at all, actually outperformed the budding T-44, which Studler wasn't happy about because he had then, by this point, hedged his bets in the T-44, and now it turns out the T-47 is going to do just slightly better. At that point, the EM2 really doesn't register. The EM2 is pretty much out of things at this point entirely. But the overarching lesson of these 1952 trials is that none of the rifles that showed up did better enough than the Garand to make them seem like they could be capable of replacing the Garand. They all still had more reliability issues. They weren't superior in reliability to the Garand, and this was something that they would need to be if they were to be able to replace it. So the T-44 and the FAL are both given feedback. They're going to be, the plan is to retest them there in 4 months. And among this feedback is the Army is no longer going to be interested very much in selecting. They're not going to be giving extreme weight to how the rifle performs in full auto, and they're also not going to care much about the presence or absence of detachable magazines. The reason for this is that in the 1952 tests, the Army found that when doing full auto tests, consistently, soldiers were less effective using full auto than they were in semi-auto. That if you were to take 2 controlled semi-auto shots, you would get them on target faster than holding down the trigger and just hoping you would land those 2 hits. And this was true for all of the select fire rifles present. And so when using select fire against a Garand, the Garand would get you your hits quicker. And so this was something that was now at the forefront of the Army's mind. Was now that they're comparing all these rifles side by side in 308, there's this first nagging question of what good does select fire do you if it's only ever going to help you waste ammo faster and miss the target more. Now, despite the fact that, as I mentioned, the T-47 actually outperformed the T-44 in many tests, a lot of the tests that the T-47 still did bad in were tests that it did bad in before. And once you've had this happen 2 trials in a row, that's usually a sign that the rifle can't really be fixed to solve the problems that it's running up against. Some guns just can't overcome some problems. And it seemed like for the T-47, this was going to be foreign debris infiltration, your sand tests and your mud tests. Meanwhile, the T-44 showed enough promise that it was given the go-ahead to continue development, as was the FAL. Both rifles are given a list of things to sort of consider, but it is pretty clear from the report, the FAL is the rifle that everyone's preferring at this point. It is the preferred rifle. It's just not better. It's not better enough than the Garand that anybody's willing to call it at this point. Additionally, in these trials, because none of these rifles did much better than the Garand, the justification was given that, because simulated combat was, of course, a part of these sorts of things, that because none of these rifles substantially did better than the Garand, it's the Army used this as a justification of their idea that magazines being detachable really doesn't help the rifle perform that much better. And so this is another little bit of a feedback that these rifles are given, is that you don't have to pay as much attention to magazines, because the worry from the Army here is they're trying to find the most advanced, most effective rifle. They don't want to force these manufacturers to use magazines, right? They don't want to have to force these designs to have to use magazines if, based on their test here, it seems like magazines might not be the most effective way to have these rifles work, because it's not really working any better than the clips in the Garand, and the clips in the Garand, as already mentioned, does have serious limitations. So that's sort of the feedback that they're given. Each rifle is sort of given a list of things to sort of address based on the failures it had in the trial, and the plan is to be back in 4 months to begin another round of testing. One final note there is that, of course, the T-47 and the EM2 were canceled at this point, and it's sort of an ironic thing that the cartridge itself that everybody's sort of committed to at this point, right? The United States, after these tests, decides that it is committed to the 7.6251 cartridge. The United States is now going to convince its NATO allies, right? They've made an FAL in this cartridge now, and this is going to end up being the most rigorous testing the FAL is going to get is through America's adoption process. And so everybody's pretty much now on board with using that 7.62 by 51 cartridge. The British probably could have put up more of a fight for 280, but it did still have its nagging accuracy issues. And it's a lot easier to abandon, because again, cartridge development is very difficult. It's probably just as difficult as rifle development itself to make a truly good cartridge. The British have been struggling with 280's accuracy problems, and it seems like the United States isn't going to try and say, well, what we've got is too secret for you losers to have, and that they're going to let other countries adopt 7.6251. So the British sort of relent. They're open to 7.62 by 51 because it means they don't have to put in the time and effort to try and solve 280 to try and make it a better option. However, I guess I should mention along the road here, the British did develop a version of 280 that had a case head that was more or less identical to 7.62 by 51 to try and make it so that it was like maybe a conversion caliber, or this way that the only difference would be the barrels and maybe the magazines, but that was also to be a doomed idea. And 7.62 by 51 would end up being the cartridge that NATO would adopt shortly after these trials. Now, this gives us a good opportunity to look at what the T44 really was. Now, as mentioned, at this point it was using T20 receivers, so those are our lengthened or slightly stretched Garand receivers, and the reason they were stretched was so that they could feed 30-06 from PAR-esque magazines. So that's sort of where this starts off. Again, the initial name for this was T35 was a Garand, more or less just converted. You're still using clips to 7.62 by 51. T36 would be the first magazine 308 Garand rifle. And through a series of developments, it evolved until it eventually became the T44. Again, you can go ahead and read more about it here. The T36 uses the regular Garand gas system. Eventually, I believe it's the later T36s, sometimes called the T36.5, converts to the direct impingement system that Garand himself favored. It was the system that he felt worked best with the Garand, and of course that ports gas off of the barrel much sooner than way out at the muzzle, and that goes through a tube, and then that tube pushes on essentially the front, or a peg on the operating rod of a sort of shortened operating rod of a Garand. So what you're seeing here out front by the gas block is not the operating rod like you're used to seeing on a Garand. This is a gas tube that brings gas back underneath the handguard, oddly enough, and this would cause some problems with sort of sustained fire versions using this same system. However, by the time the T44 rolls around, the direct impingement system is gone, and they have now switched to what's known as the white piston system after the designer, white with a capital W. More or less the theory behind the way this piston works is that the piston itself floats inside of a gas cylinder. Whenever the piston, which is hollow at the front, takes gas from the barrel, the gas flows through the piston and then through the front of the piston to push on the front of the gas cylinder, which pushes the piston backwards. Once the piston is pushed backwards, then it will cut itself off from the gas flow from the barrel. The marketing behind this idea is that if you're using a round that's got a little bit hotter gas port pressure versus a little bit less hot gas port pressure, because it's a fixed orifice that shuts itself off after a set amount of travel of the piston, you're always going to get a fixed volume of gas. And that fixed volume of gas will adjust itself based on the pressure, because if it's higher pressure, it'll shut itself off sooner, so it won't get as much gas. The problem is this is pseudoscientific nonsense, and it doesn't actually work that way. And if you shoot an M1 Garand with hotter loaded 308, or a Garand or an M14, right, a rifle with this white gas system, if you shoot it with hotter 308, it will cycle harder than if you shoot it with softer loaded 308, which should have been enough to demonstrate that the whole gas system being self-adjusting, self-regulating volume system is just nonsense and added complexity. And this is probably why Garand was an opponent to this sort of a system being used, but I digress. It was the system that was settled on. Compared to the Garand's initial system, right? People like to say about the M14 that, well, the Garand always worked great, and they went and overcomplicated the gas system to make it worse. And I'm not going to say that the design of the gas system is fundamentally better, because had they just made the M14 long stroke with the gas port location moved back on the barrel, it would have been an improvement, and probably even an improvement over the quasi-short stroke white piston system that's in the M14. However, this is a big however, the Garand's original gas system was not good. And I'm not talking the gas trap system, because the gas trap system was bad. The improved gas system that had a gas port way out close to the muzzle was not good. The fact that the gas cylinder has a part that had to be removed for disassembly wasn't good. This was known to have potential for accuracy issues with the Garand, right? Because you now have a removable part that your front sight is attached to. And if the splines in the barrel get damaged or the gas cylinder just doesn't fit very tight with it, you now have a wobbly front sight that your piston is ramming into after every shot, which just isn't conducive for good accuracy. All sorts of problems arose from the way the Garand's gas system was designed, like having to have a large gas port with very short dwell time, which led to, in combination with a leaky gas block system, a rifle that either wanted to cycle too much or it didn't want to cycle consistently, where if you drill a smaller gas port, it would cycle most of the time until the one time that things line up just right that it leaks too much gas off, and then you have a gun that doesn't want to work right, or is more prone to action freezing because of the fact that it didn't have enough oomph behind it. So this is sort of the problem that the Garand has. It did need a gas system redesign. The gas system redesign did not have to be as it was on the T-44, right? It didn't have to be the fixed volume expansion cutoff system. It could have just been long stroke still and just had the gas port moved back a little bit closer and everything would have been fine. Especially it was like a press fit, actually sealed gas block system that's taking the gas off the barrel. However, this is the situation things ended up in. So to the people who say it was overcomplicated and unnecessary, that's maybe overcomplicated, but absolutely not unnecessary. The Garand's gas system did need to change. I know people like to point to the BM-59 and to say, well, look, why didn't the U.S. just do the BM-59? Well, the BM-59 had its own host of reliability problems, most of which were just copy-pasted from the reliability problems the Garand had, because the BM-59 is just a Garand that just takes .308 magazines, right? That's just what it is. And the U.S. had the opportunity to solve those here. And if the trial reports are to be believed, which, there's no reason not to believe them. I know that there's some people, right, that are probably right out there in the comments being like, the government lied in the trial reports. We'll get to that sort of in the conclusion section, why some of the conspiracy theories just aren't true. But probably the best reason to believe the conspiracy theories aren't true is that the Army at large was nonstop convinced the FAL was the right rifle to adopt, until the FAL's problems started to come out in testing. So to have everybody put their swords away for the moment, that's just not quite how that worked out. But that's more or less your T-44, right? That's how it got where it was. The Garand's original gas system wasn't fully developed. There's a reason we didn't just do the BM-59, and it's because just the M1 Garand probably wasn't good enough. Also, the BM-59 came after this, which is sort of a funky thing to wrap your head around, but that's neither here nor there. Here's a guy who looks like he's having a great time shooting an M14, or T-44 rather, left-handed, and you can see it being a .308. I'm not sure if that's a cartridge case up by his hood or not, but M14s will sometimes do that to left-handed people, the .308 Garand thing where it tries to eject cases into your face. Now, because there was only 4 months for these changes to be made, a lot of features were borrowed from the T-47/T-25 for the T-44 here. Of course, it had that muzzle brake system that it more or less borrowed straight from the T-47. And this was the T-44 as trialed, right? There was 4 months to make changes to it past this point, but both before and after, it did borrow design inspirations and cues from the T-47. The initial batch of T-44 rifles ended up being those T-20 receivers, as mentioned, but Remington built the rest of the guns with those T-20 receivers that Springfield had made. You can sort of read through the quick list of changes here. I don't want to belabor the actual minute details of the development of the T-44, only to say that it certainly did have a sort of lightning round of changes made to it. Now, following those 1952 trials where the T-44 was given a list of recommendations, of course, those recommendations given to both the FAL and the T-44 was maybe we don't need interchangeable, replaceable, detachable magazines, and maybe we don't need select fire the way we thought we did. So this gets us to the 3 versions of T-44 that sort of get spawned. These are a lightweight rifle, a sort of medium weight rifle, and then a heavyweight/automatic fire dedicated rifle, where the previous 2 variants have a lightweight barrel, the latter variant has a heavy barrel. The first variant has a 10-round semi-permanent magazine, so it requires disassembly of the rifle to get the magazine out of the gun, and it was just to be fed from the top with stripper clips. the middle rifle there, sort of the automatic but not heavy automatic rifle, if you will, the medium weight rifle perhaps, was to have 20 round interchangeable magazines and select fire capability. That 10 round rifle, by the way, would have select fire capability disabled. And then the heavy rifle would end up having select fire, 20 round magazines, bipod, heavy barrel, the works. Now, it's useful to understand. Remember that the Army was looking to have one rifle replace all of their existing hardware. But one of the things that the T-44 was trying to do here is to say, well, it's technically one rifle. We've just got different variants of it. And this is realistically the only way that the one rifle that does everything is ever going to be achieved, right? Because the Russians have done it with the AK pretty successfully. But like the RPK is not just an AK. It's in fact substantially modified in several different key ways. And so more or less what was happening here was Springfield was getting the jump on saying, hey, look, this is what the different models of T-44 would look like. If you adopted it, this is what we'd have, is we'd have the general infantry rifle, which is this 10 round stripper clip, semi-auto only sort of a thing. We could also have the sort of medium firepower rifle and then the heavy firepower rifle. And these variants will all end up getting tested, but it's really just that sort of medium firepower rifle that gets the most testing done to it, because that's sort of the one that's the closest analog to the FAL as the FAL's getting tested, though there is eventually a heavy barrel version of the FAL that's in the mix that's analogous to sort of the heavy fire T-44. As an additional part of this program, they end up designing a rate reducer. I believe it's Garand. I mean, Garand is credited as having designed it. I don't know if it was actually him who designed it, but there's a rate reducer that they end up introducing to the heavy fire version of the T-44. However, I believe it's on this T-44, and if not, it was earlier on the T-20, which had a similar rate reducer, where if the rate reducer fails, it will just dump the remainder of the magazine, even if you release the trigger. And these rate reducers were prone to breaking and doing that. Additionally, whenever the rate reducers were tested, the sort of conclusion was that even at 400 rounds per minute, your automatic fire from the shoulder doesn't really get any more accurate because it's still too fast, and that at that point they'd rather it just be semi-auto only for shoulder fire, and so the rate reducer doesn't really do them any good. In this 4 months of change, probably the one thing that's identified as needing to be fixed that doesn't have time to get fixed is that they are still using T20 based receivers for these T-44s, and they're still using a spacer block to enable feeding reliably from a magazine. This isn't something that's going to be useful for large scale production, because why wouldn't you just make the receiver you need for large scale production? And this is something that the Army identifies in the coming 1953 trials, that, oh my god, the T-44 is still not got its own receiver. It's still using a modified, bastardized 30-06 based receiver. And this is something that the T-44 will have held against it pretty severely. And by 1953, pretty much all of the Army is of the opinion that the direction things need to go is an adoption of the FAL. Now, unfortunately, the 1953 trials test data I have not found available online, and while I would certainly love to comb through it, sort of the broad summaries of what had happened covers in sufficient detail what we need to know. So the trials were set to start in July 1st, 1953. They were going to include first warm weather testing, and then the rifles were to be shipped up in the winter to Alaska, where they were going to be subjected to extreme cold weather testing. That this in 1953, the concept is getting closer to, right? Again, 1953 is not going to crown what rifle we're adopting, but this is meant to again be sort of a down selection process, where if either rifle's showing that it straight up can't do it, that means we need to discard it so that we can focus on the likely candidates. In that warm weather testing, the T-44 is just handily getting beat by the FAL. FAL is just consistently performing better than the T-44, and as far as the Army is concerned, it really looks like this is pretty much the end. Even Springfield Armory is looking at this going, that's pretty much the ball game. It's over. Time for us to pack up and go home. It was a good try. The fucking chocolate people have beat us. Morale is not fantastic for Springfield Armory, and the Army itself is pretty much ready to put a bow on this. The FAL is succeeding in the warm weather test, and the T-44, which is obviously still not, they're still not testing a finished rifle, right? They're testing a rifle that has a spacer block and a receiver that doesn't even really belong to it. And it's still not doing very good at all. struggling in these warm weather tests, struggling in the sort of dust tests and the the simulated combat tests and the sorts of things that they're putting it through. As the T-44 was having problems, Springfield Armory did come out to try and see what was happening. As best they could figure, the rifle was having consistent magazine friction issues, that most of the issues the rifle were having were sort of spurred on by it having failures to feed, in that remedying these failures to feed would end up causing other failures or foreign objects to get into the action as the action is held open for unnecessarily long. And that this is sort of the things that Springfield points to as this is probably what's going wrong with the rifle. But of course, as far as the Army is concerned, it's not even a complete rifle in the first place, and you should probably stop complaining because you didn't even finish your rifle, really finish your rifle design in time for these tests. So the Army certainly isn't giving Springfield an out. They're not giving them a chance to fix it. The Army is forging on ahead, and pretty much everybody has come to the conclusion that what's going on here is that the FAL rifle is winning, and FN has this one, is the gut feel that everybody sort of has. The warm weather tests wrap up, and while there isn't an official report completed because the Arctic tests are still going to be a part of, a combined part of these trials, sort of the preliminary report says the T-44 is out, right? Like it failed these trials. It's not acceptable. Meanwhile, it was found that in this testing, the FAL was on par, if not better than the Garand. So for the first time, we have a rifle that seems like it's better than the Garand, at least in the warm weather. And the FAL is going to move forward, which means that really, at this point, the T-44 is pretty much roundly defeated. Springfield petitions to say, just in case, why don't we send the T-44 up to the cold weather test as well, so that way there's at least a benchmark for the FAL to compete against. So if the FAL is to succeed, right, if the FAL is to be the plan going forward, we'll at least see how much better the FAL is in the cold, since we've already seen how much better it is in the warm. However, it's up there on the cold in Alaska that sort of the unthinkable happens for the team at FN. The FAL simply will not run in the cold. Consistently having cycling problems, if it's short stroking, if it's failing to feed, the bolts hanging up or getting frozen in place, the rifle will not work. FN is informed of this, and of course FN had a long history of complaining about how the Army tested rifles, because when the Army was testing rifles, Springfield's staff wasn't allowed to sort of witness the testing as to put undue influence on it. But Springfield staff, because they had security clearances and they were all privy to it, were able to know how specific rifles were doing while the tests were going on. FN was not allowed to know how rifles were doing while the test was going on. And I think a lot of the whole, it was rigged against FN, the whole tests were rigged, comes from the fact that FN's team went to newspapers to talk about the fact that they're not letting us see how our rifles are doing, which wasn't unusual, right? That, if you weren't briefed, if you didn't have security clearances, if you weren't a part of the Army, you didn't get to know how tests were doing. It's not like they just did that for foreign competitors. They did that for domestic competitors as well. But FN caused a big stink about that, and I think that stink ended up ingraining itself in people's minds as, well, the Army was playing dirty tricks or foul games, when in reality what was happening was the T-44 was losing and Springfield was going, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit the entire time. Now, come the time that the FAL started having serious problems, the Army told FN, hey, the FAL's freezing up. It's simply not working in the cold. Do you guys want to come take a look at it? So the FN fly one of their engineers out. He identifies the problem as the rifles aren't getting enough gas even whenever they're set for the adverse gas condition. So he makes the field expedient fix of taking the rifles and drilling out, with a drill, the gas ports a little bit larger. The little bit larger ended up being too large, and now the rifles are having cases bounce themselves back into the action because the rifle's cycling too hard. It's having the guns crack parts, right? It's breaking extractors and firing pins now because the action is cycling too hard. All sorts of problems, all sorts of things, right? Everything that can go wrong for a rifle now ends up going wrong with the FAL. And then the official report has to be the FAL isn't ready for service either. And perhaps as some token of mercy, the Army report for the T-44 says, well, it does work in the cold. I don't think they said it was satisfactory. I think they said that they still wanted to see it improve. But it did remarkably better than the FAL because, the FALs had to be modified, and the modification showed that actually the parts in this rifle are very fragile, and gassing the rifle just a little bit more than it was originally intended to be gassed starts breaking all of these pieces. So The end result of those trials is, again, there's no rifle that's actually ready for adoption. And it's the opinion of the Army that because the T-44 sort of redeemed itself in the cold, it will be given the go-ahead so that the FAL isn't the sole rifle at this point, because the FAL had done so poorly. That the FAL's, the way that I've seen it described is that the FAL's cold weather performance was so much worse than the T-44's cold weather performance, even though the T-44's cold weather performance wasn't actually deemed sufficient, that even whenever you take into consideration that the T4 or the FAL was sufficient in the warm weather and the T-44 wasn't, the disparity there wasn't very great, whereas the disparity in the cold was substantial enough that the T-44 was given a chance to go ahead and improve itself, as was the FAL. So now we get another round of development for both of these rifles. As the next round of trials are ramping up, the United States Army, not Springfield, mind you, the Army at large, places an order for 3,000 FALs configured as they think they want them. A 3,000 rifle order, when thus far it's just been sort of low production rate samples being tested, usually signals that a decision has been made. And I think this event on its own is enough to point to go that the Army wasn't biased in favor of the T-44 really at any point in these trials. If anything, they were biased pretty substantially in the favor of the FAL, to the point of trying to soft adopt the FAL by ordering 3,000 of them in advance of having any such plan for the T-44. Because, I think really the only reasonable explanation there, right, is that the Army wanted the FAL at this point, but Springfield was still doing their best to come up with their own. And of course, it is worth mentioning that at this point in these trials, there have been no real consideration given to what it's going to take to actually make the FAL in the U.S. When I explained that, the struggle of adopting a foreign rifle, we're still at the threshold issue of, is this rifle actually good in the first place, before we get to the real question of, is it so good that it's worth the trouble of us learning how to make it ourselves here? Yet more proof of this is the fact that, after sort of the upset in the Arctic, if you will, the comeback of the underdog, the T-44 obviously is going to have time to redesign itself, and really the thing that's going to get redesigned, most clearly needing that redesign, is it's going to get its own receiver design, finally. Now, the Army, and in fact Springfield Armory, understands that it's not going to be fair if just one of these rifles gets a chance to have U.S.-funded development put into it. And so the decision is made that the United States will, at this point, begin investigating that. What's it going to take for us to make FALs on our own? What's it going to take for us to develop our own improvements to the FAL system here in America? And so that decision is made, and initially it's actually Springfield that gets the go-ahead to, you guys are now going to figure out making the FAL. However, eventually this delegation is taken away from Springfield because the Army itself questions the propriety of, is it proper to have them designing both rifles? Because, eventually someone's boss would just be able to pick the favorite rifle and put more money in that pot. So eventually a different arms development end of the Army is given the go-ahead to develop the FAL side of things. Now, there's going to be 3 more updates here that we need to be aware of with the FAL. First is that Canada will adopt the FAL. Second is that the UK will adopt the FAL. The eyes of the NATO countries will now turn to the US to see what the US will do. The US is, of course, committed to at least a few more trials to go on here. After the 53, 54 Arctic trials that sort of saw the T-44 prove that, well, maybe it's not always worse than the FAL, and it's at least valid in some circumstances, and they're both worthy of further investigation. Sort of the third FAL development here at this point is that 3,000 rifle order of FALs for the U.S. configured as the U.S. wants them will become known as the T-48. And I will do my best from here on to refer to those specific rifles as T-48. What makes a T-48 different? More or less, it's the same pattern of FAL that Canada was adopting. It was going to be, that inch conversion that I had mentioned earlier, right? Canada would work with the U.S. as far as pulling off the inch conversion, and so the rifles would be fairly similar. Only the U.S. would insist on having a winter trigger guard designed into the rifle that, interestingly, Canada wasn't as insistent on. But, of course, the U.S. does do more cold stuff than Canada. What with, they have people in Alaska, and Canada doesn't have quite the military presence as far north as the United States does. And of course, the United States sort of needs this far north of a military presence because we put all sorts of cool stuff in Alaska, like missiles and aeroplanes. And there may be submarine bases there, at least at this point in history. I'm not entirely sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was at least an intent on doing that. So the United States has all sorts of fun stuff that they're doing in the north and want a winter trigger guard on the T-48. Of course, as I'd mentioned, Springfield was initially delegated the task of trying to improve and figure out what it would take to make the T-48. Even before Springfield has that delegation taken away from him, Springfield realizes this isn't a job they can do on their own. So they actually contract out to High Standard to have High Standard do the engineering, and High Standard will coordinate with the Canadians as far as doing the engineering to convert everything to inch and to convert the drawings into something that that engineers on this side of the pond and machinists on this side of the pond can look at and go, yeah, I know what that means, as opposed to, I wonder how they make anything over there. Meanwhile, on the T-44 side of things, development, as I mentioned, sort of focuses on the receiver. Springfield again realizes they're probably not going to have on their own the capability to do everything themselves. So they contract out to a man named Dave Mathewson, who has a small independent tool and die shop that was looking for more small arms related to work. And they end up going ahead and striking a deal where John Garand, who had previously contracted with Springfield, would switch his contracting arrangement to work with Dave Mathewson instead, and then Springfield would work with Dave Mathewson and Garand on that end of things to get the T-44 developed to the place that they wanted it. This was a little bit of an interesting arrangement, but it did work out very well for them. Mathewson was a very skilled and very quick manufacturing whiz, and they were able to manufacture very low-rate initial guns. Springfield would test the heck out of them. Garand and Mathewson and Springfield would sit down and discuss what they thought needed to change in order to address the problems, and they'd have a new rifle ready very quickly with those changes worked into it. This was a very good synergy, very similar synergy to what was going on with the T-48 as far as how High Standard was working with the Canadians and trying to glean what they could there, also coordinating with the UK across the pond, and to some extent the Belgians, though the Belgians couldn't really help us with what an inch meant. Another thing that Garand and Mathewson sort of work on redesigning is the magazine. As mentioned, it seemed like in those warm weather tests, the big problem the T-44 was having was its magazines. At this point, it was using pretty close to the original Garand T-31 magazine, that weird bullpup that I'd mentioned before. That bullpup had a compound feed lip, though, so the feed lip was bent in two places, sort of like a two feed lips per side of the magazine, and that seemed like it was causing undue drag on feeding cartridges. So Garand and Mathewson go ahead and take a stab at designing a magazine that just has a single feed lip instead of that sort of compound system, because the single feed lip, while it will provide less control of feeding cartridges, it will provide less drag. And it seems like with their new redesigned receiver, they don't need as much control over cartridges because the rounds will now be right up against the chamber and it will feed like a normal rifle. There'll no longer be like a half-inch spacer that the rounds have to cross over, which would necessitate the use of a magazine that holds onto the cartridge for longer, which of course means more friction. As a part of High Standard's efforts to go ahead and effectively redesign for inch and American manufacturing standards, the T-48, High Standard had agreed to manufacture 12 of these rifles just as a sort of proof of concept, make sure that our drawings work, make sure that the rifles made to our drawings actually work correctly. And then the Army around this point, seeing that both rifles are developing, they're making progress, decides that what the sort of next big phase of trials should be is that they take 500 T-44s, 500 T-48s, take a hand selection of rifles, random selection of the rifles from these batches, and then take those and then trial them against each other. What this really represents is your low-rate initial production trials. 500 for rifles can be a little bit high for low-rate initial production, but it really shows that the Army is getting ready to be serious about these two rifles. If they're willing to bankroll the production of 500 of each of these to see which of them is probably going to give them more of what they want. So things are certainly starting to heat up as far as the competition between these two. Prior to those 500 rifles being produced, though, of course we have Mathewson already manufacturing these T-44s, iterating as they go, and we have High Standard working in the latest improvements from the British and the Canadians as they're working on redrawing these things for those 12 rifles that they were contracted to make. And the Army decides that it would be worthwhile to take these sort of initial, early, super low-rate production rifles and run them head-to-head against each other, more or less just to validate that the American systems of manufacturing would work good for the T-48, and that the T-44 actually did succeed in redesigning a receiver and improving itself to the point that it's now caught up developmentally with the T-48. In the lead up to the trials of those super low-rate production guns, remember the about 12 guns being manufactured and trialed against each other, the production runs of 500 guns were given contracts. Harrington and Richardson was to make the 500 T-48s, and Springfield would elect to make the 500 T-44s to the Mathewson design, all on their own. It was decided that these super low-rate trials, right, the Mathewson manufactured T-44s compared to the high standard T-48s, would also include the first round of those T-48s that FN had made from that 3,000 rifle order. The high standard rifles were way behind schedule, though. They weren't quite actually in production on time to meet the trials. And as a result of this, the trials, which were originally going to be cold weather first and then followed by warm weather, ended up being cold weather and warm weather trials that ran later in the year, and they ran simultaneously instead of one after the other, due to the delay that High Standard was facing with the FAL. I haven't been able to find the actual detailed breakdown of how these trials went. However, the final report for these trials does indicate that the T-44 did still outperform the FAL in the cold, but they still weren't satisfied with the performance of the T-44 in the cold. However, a new issue for the FAL popped up during the warm weather portion of the tests. The FAL was consistently having trouble with sand. This was a problem that the British in their adoption of the FAL had also noticed. The FAL, especially whenever it's introduced to very fine-grained sand, will consistently jam up due to how close a fit the bolt carrier has to both its top cover and the rails in the receiver. The British would go about designing what was known as the sand cutter bolt to try and address this. And the sand cutter bolt, to some extent, is a little bit controversial. Probably a topic for a whole nother time if we wanted to make a version of this video that focused more on the FAL than on the M14. However, the sort of conclusion, the best conclusion I've been able to come to in my limited research on the sand cutter is that initially it will do a better job at keeping sand out of the gun. However, once the sand cuts themselves get full of sand, the rifle will become hilariously locked up to the point of can't even really try to limp it back into service, and the gun will then require a full breakdown. So it seems to me like what the sand cutters really do for you is they just increase the amount of sand that the gun can tolerate. They don't really divert that sand into a place that it can pool up and accumulate without hampering effectiveness of the rifle. The sand testing went so bad for the FAL, in fact, that the testing itself was paused because it was understood that the FAL simply cannot deal with the sand. And the testing was given a little bit of a hiatus to give the FAL the opportunity to go ahead and redesign itself. This is whenever the T-48, when it put its heads together with what was going on in the UK. Canada was also able to confirm that the sand intrusion issue was something that the FAL was having major issues with. This more or less concluded the report of that sort of early pre-production sample test, if we can call it that. And again, just to reiterate, the T-44 performed better in the cold, and it also performed better in the sand, although the impression that I've been given is that otherwise, the FAL did a little bit better in just general reliability. The FAL was better in terms of not breaking parts. However, the M14, the T-44 rather, was more accurate than the T-48 was. And this was a theme that would continue throughout most of the testing, is that regardless if it was in 280 or 308, the FAL was just not nearly as accurate as the T-44. This brings us right up to the production sample trials. At least that's what I take to calling them. The samples where they randomly selected the rifles from the 500 lot groups. And I want to reiterate that when it comes to this sort of a trial, again, the trials that we've been discussing thus far are trials that take place fairly regularly. Pretty much any time that there's a new kid on the block when it comes to gun design, those sorts of trials take place where the Army will sit down and evaluate it to determine how mature the design is, to determine if the design does something better than what already exists, sort of just to get a feeling for where this particular rifle or particular program is actually at. These sort of tests happen, especially at this point in history, constantly. However, production sample trials are entirely different. This is the sort of thing where it's like this, I hate to use the cliche, but it's sort of like the Super Bowl of rifle trials, where well, it's actually not that great of an analogy because production sample rifle trials do not happen every year. In fact, they happen every 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. It can go a really long time before you actually have production sample trials taking place. And because it's such a long time, like even 5 years between production sample trials is a very long time. And what this will cause is that in 5 years, the things that the Army thinks the Army wants have changed drastically. If they want magazines, or they don't want magazines, or they want select fire, or they want a light cartridge, or they want one that's actually just like 30-06 was, these things will change in the span of 5 years, which will entirely change. If you change your motivations and change your requirements, it's going to change what you're actually going to be testing for when it comes time to run these trials. Additionally, these trials are extremely expensive, extremely complex, sometimes spanning multiple months of coordinated testing, because it's difficult to push a rifle to its limits. But pushing one rifle to its limits isn't good enough. You need to push multiple rifles to its limits, and every failure has to be accounted for and tracked and documented, and you have to attempt to understand it. And the sorts of people shooting these guns can't just be anybody. You need a representative example of the people who are going to be fielding these guns in the field. And you're going to need to monitor them to make sure that they're not doing things extraordinarily dumb, because, of course, you need dumb people to be able to use your gun, but you don't want extraordinarily dumb people to go ahead and throw the numbers off for how your rifle's actually performing. All this to say, these sorts of trials are extremely difficult, and it makes me roll my eyes whenever I see people suggest that, oh, well, these trials were rigged, or, oh, you can't trust the data or the results from these trials, they were all falsified. There's a substantial number of eyes on these trials. There's a substantial amount of things writing on these trials, and national pride is not what leads it's not what leads the Army to make a decision. The Army is interested in having the best rifle it possibly can. It is not interested in saying, oh boy, we're going to lose the next war we're in, but at least we'll lose it with an American rifle. This just isn't the sort of things that get said, at least not at a high level. Perhaps, individual actors at Springfield, if Studler was still around at this point, Studler would probably have an attitude like that it's better to lose a war with an American rifle than win one with the chocolate French rifle. But in actuality, that's not the prevailing attitude of the Army, and it's not the prevailing attitude of any Army that actually wins wars. So again, these trials are production sample trials. With your randomly selected lot of rifles, sort of one of the key things that you're supposed to be looking at is that the rifles here should exemplify the things that you've been looking to see so far. So in this case, it's a rifle that's more effective than the M1 Garand, but could also potentially replace, right, that little asterisk, is it would be great if it could replace everything else that they already have going on right now. Of course, by now, the caliber is already was settled already in earlier trials, so they don't really need to go and nail that down any further, because they've already got an agreement on what the caliber is going to be. And this trial, remember, is a comparison of the 500 Springfield manufactured T-44s now, compared to the 500 H&R manufactured T-48s. So this is different from the previous trial, which compared the Mathewson T-44s to the high standard T-48s to the FN T-48s. This one's just looking at the U.S. manufactured options, because of course, when it comes time for adoption, you're going to be adopting one of the U.S. manufactured rifles. It's just how it works. However, right off the bat, things aren't going fantastic for the T-48. They aren't really ready for the trials to begin on time. They're still running into issues with extractors or firing pins breaking, and this leads the U.S. to sort of put its head together with UK and FN to try and figure out why the U.S. manufactured T-48s are having this problem. And the end conclusion is that really the only way that they're going to get parts that are going to avoid breaking is if the T-48s are allowed to sort of violate the core tenet of these production trials, which is the guns need to have completely interchangeable parts, and this needs to establish the guns actually work and can be assembled this way. The T-48, most of the core parts have demonstrated this is possible, but not all of the parts are there yet. So the T-48 probably should have been knocked for the fact that it really wasn't quite making the whole interchangeable parts connection, at least at this point. However, it's important to remember that even at this point, the Army is still of the opinion that it's going to be adopting the T-48 in the end, right? They've ordered 3,000 of the things, which is a ton. It certainly seems that that's the way that everybody's expectations are at least set for the T-48 to now show off in this production trials to be the superior rifle. While the H&R T-48s were still having their issues worked out, the Army went ahead and ordered a test of the high standard T-48s with those dust-slotted bolts. So if you remember previously, this test was suspended while the the FAL, the US FAL, was given the opportunity to confer with the UK to see what to do about the sand infiltration issues. But the Army essentially wanted to test, okay, so now that we've got sort of the sand cutter bolts, how does that actually stack up? Does that actually seem like that improved anything? So they compare the latest T-44s against the high standard T-48 with that sand cutting bolt, and even still, the T-44 ends up landing a full percentage point ahead of the T-48 in total malfunctions across that trial. In the combat portion of the tests, right, the malfunction rate still showed the T-44 ahead of the T-48, and that's regardless of whether it was the FN T-48s or the high standard T-48s. The end result of these tests was almost comically another suspension. Another test is going to be paused so that, essentially, in this particular test, sort of the reason that the Army would want to pause it is because they don't want to come out and say, the FAL's got problems and we let them fix the problems and the problems are still there and the T-44 is doing better than it. And the Army doesn't want to say this because they just ordered 3,000 of these rifles, and they don't want to have to explain why they ordered 3,000 of the rifles that it turns out are actually worse, because it doesn't look good when you go back to Congress and ask them for money to go, we bought the wrong guns. Anyway, we need more money. So again, the Army has now suspended an additional test where it shows that the T-44 is outperforming the T-48. I don't want to say that this is them playing favoritism. More like this is the Army saying that, well, this wasn't meant to be the end-all be-all test. We just wanted to get an idea of how things were. So we don't want to put together an official report because this was just a, hey, did this improve things? And while it did sure seem like it improved things, it certainly didn't solve things. And it certainly didn't have the T-48 outperforming the T-44 like much of the Army thought that it was supposed to. Almost comically, by the time that H&R finally has rifles submitted to the production trials test, to actually get things compared side by side, it turns out that the barrels that H&R had been putting into these T-48s were manufactured improperly, had oversized bores, and weren't actually capable of meeting the accuracy requirement in the first place. This sort of throws things well and truly off the rails, because at this point we have 2 trials that have been suspended, a side test that has been suspended, and so the Army decides that it's going to sweep these tests thus far under the rug, and it's going to start with a fresh slate, because at this point, things have been drug out because of delays with T-48s, T-48 having issues that they had to pause tests to fix, only then it didn't fix it, and then the Army wasn't going to say that it wasn't fixed, because to some extent, again, it's not favoritism, but the T-48 is expected to be the favorite. And when you expect it to be the favorite, you sort of need to have it be the favorite, or you're going to be more interested in having, justifying it becoming the favorite. Because what these tests were supposed to do was make the T-44 go away. Unfortunately, it was sticking around. And so the decision is made is that actually what they're going to do now is forget about those tests. In 1956, they'll have the end-all be-all test. It'll be comprehensive, head-to-head, every kind of simulated combat, cold weather, warm weather, mud test, sand test, dirt test, beach tests, saltwater tests, everything. They're going to test everything about these rifles side by side against each other, production sample guns. This is going to be it. Everybody bring your popcorn because it's going to be a show. And wouldn't you know it, these tests fall through because it's just a giant logistical issue. The tests were going to, the way that they were planning the tests, it was going to end up taking another year of testing for these tests to happen, assuming the tests started on time, and the T-48 had proven it was incapable of showing up on time for a single trial at this point, even the trials where it was going to be favored. But this test falls through. Everybody's too impatient to actually wait for that. And really that makes a lot of sense because it's been 11 years at this point. It's been 11 years the Army has spent laboring over trying to find the better rifle. And what have they got at this point? They got the T-48s that don't work and the T-44, which, while the T-44 was a product of America's own, it's not like they were ignorant to the fact that what this really was a product improved Garand. And they were kind of looking for something new, and they weren't going to get that at this point. The results of the final test are sort of summed up here. What it ended up being was sort of simulated combat tests with the Army and then also with the Marines. The results more or less speak for themselves. While both of the rifles, the T-44 and the T-48, pretty much hands down beat the M1 finally, except for, in some cases, the M1's a little bit quicker to disassemble. The more interesting thing to pay attention to here is that the T-44 is more accurate, it's more reliable, although not by much, but most importantly, it's quite a bit lighter than the T-48. And the lightness and the accuracy really end up being the two things that are sort of substantially more in favor of the T-44. Of course, looking at your average number of failures in your parts breakage, this is a 6,000 round endurance test, how many parts broke, 2 versus 6. One way of looking at that is that, well, it's only 4 more parts that broke. The other way of looking at it is it's 3 times as many parts broke. Probably the most fair way to look at that is 6 times this rifle would have got someone could have got someone killed versus 2 times this could have got someone killed. These sorts of tests do matter. In parts breakage, especially this late in a trial, isn't acceptable. And the T-48 just has more of that going on. Additionally, when it comes to malfunction rate, we're looking at 3 failures in 100 versus 17 failures in 100. That's just much worse for the T-48 there. And it was from these results that the Army would come back, write up a report, and then sit on it for a year. Nobody at the Army was ready to say the hard truth out loud, which was the rifle they had felt was going to win the entire time was the FAL. And it turns out that whenever the rubber met the road, the FAL could not perform, right? It couldn't get the job done, and the T-44 outperformed it. I guess I should be careful saying it couldn't get the job done, because the end conclusion of this report was either rifle is suitable for adoption. You can look at this one of several ways. One of the first ways to look at it is, because the T-48 made it far enough that it made it to that sort of low-rate initial production, the answer to can you make it in your country in the first place is now yes, right? We did make it here. Here it is, right? The FALs we made here versus the M14s we made here. So you've sort of got the answer to that question already. So now the sort of question becomes, which rifle actually did better? But then the question is, did it do better by enough to make a difference? I would say, looking at these numbers, the answer is yes. The T-44 just did hands down better. However, this was just simulated combat training. This was not your sort of in-depth mud tests, dust tests, and cold weather tests, and saltwater tests, right? Those did not end up happening in this instance. This was just those simulated combat tests. Now, that said, simulated combat tests are probably a pretty good read. And if in fair weather conditions, now the T-48 is doing better, or rather the T-44 is doing better than the T-48, where previously the T-48 had been the better rifle in those conditions, I think it's a pretty sure sign to say that the T-44 has come a really long way, and it's surpassed both developmentally in terms of design maturity and in terms of its performance, the T-48. Like I said, the Army sits on this report for a year, and the ultimate decision is made to go with the T-44. You can try and read tea leaves as to why, the actual factors, how much they weighed on the Army in making this decision. However, I think it really just comes down to the T-44 showed that it was lightweight, right? It had that lightweight advantage to it, a little bit lighter rifle. Really, the big benefit of that lightweight is that whenever you're going to make your heavy barrel version of it, it's also then going to be lighter. Additionally, improved accuracy certainly couldn't have hurt it, and the improved reliability and less parts breakage absolutely couldn't have hurt it. And there's also this story that gets thrown around a lot, right? The question of reuse of tooling. Reuse of tooling is cited in support of why the T-44 should be adopted. And a lot of people say, well, but then actually guess what? They didn't use any Garand tooling when they made an M14. And as far as I can tell, this isn't true. There have been people who have given enough reason and given enough evidence to make them believable that they did actually work to manufacture M14 parts. And they said that they started with their old Garand tooling, modified their Garand tooling to work for M14s, and went from there. If you would take a machinist approach to what tooling means, there may have been some miscommunication, or it may have been Springfield intentionally tried to confuse people about this. I'm not entirely sure. However, whenever you say tooling, there's more than one thing you can mean. Tooling can include the machinery that you use to manufacture stuff when that machinery is sort of specific to the tasks that you're doing, which includes the use of shapers, for example. I would consider shapers more in the category of tooling, especially the way that they're set up, especially the way that they're used on the Garand. The shapers that were used on the Garand could be reused for the M14. For a fact, one of the most critical tools, one of the most complicated tools for the Garand or any rifle that used what's known as indexed barrel timing, where the threads on the barrel are machined so that they will always line up with the threads on the receiver the same way. And of course that means the receiver threads are always cut cut consistently, and your barrel threads are always cut consistently, especially because your barrel isn't just a consistent round profile. It has features and shapes on it in addition to just, instead of just being a round profile. This is sort of the most complicated task one of the most complicated tasks when it comes to mass manufacture of a rifle is, if you're going to have more than one production line making receivers, it's not like you can just have one machine that cuts all those threads. You got to sync up multiple different machines to sync up multiple different threads, and you got to have a fixture that's used multiple different places, potentially even multiple different factories, multiple different physical locations that's being used to validate these threads are good before you say this is a good part. And if you take a Garand barrel and try to thread it in to an M14, the threads time out the same way. I find it very, very, very unlikely that you can't just reuse just reuse the Garand tooling that was created for barrel timing for the M14. I find that highly unlikely. So to the question, as far as the question of was tooling reused, I think there's evidence it was reused. I think there's people who have given reasonable explanations about, well, I made these parts, or I worked there and I did this, or I saw the tools, or I used the tools, or I used the tools during the war or after the war. And people who have explained, yes, Garand tooling was in fact reused, that there is support to the idea that Garand tooling was reused. Now, and I don't know that this is the story that was told or the story that was used to justify the M14's adoption, but if the version of the story was we can use all of the Garand tooling because it's literally just a Garand, that's demonstrably not true, because the receiver isn't actually the same. There's actually very few number of parts that are the same. Early on, the extractors were the same, but those ended up changing. Really, the only parts that ended up being entirely interchangeable was a couple of parts in the fire control group. And I think some people, and I think I've seen that like the handguard retainers or end caps, or it's really small non-function critical parts, end up being the interchangeable pieces. Like literally could have been made from existing Garand stock, if not Garand tooling. But that's pretty much that story there. And so for a combination of these factors, like probably the big factor is it did better, and the other factor is, at the end of the day, if you are to, all else being equal, if you're to pick the rifle made by the Chocolate French or the rifle made by the Americans, you will pick the rifle made by the Americans. But I want to stress that at the end of this hours-long presentation, if the impression you come away with after learning all this is, well, it was purely political, the Americans just picked the American rifle, I think you're a dumb, stupid idiot. Because multiple steps along the way, the FAL is given another chance, and we'll cancel this test, and oh, don't worry, you don't have to turn your homework in, or oh, we'll just waive you on this test. You don't have to do that. It's not a big deal. We're not going to write any bad things about you in the newspaper, dude. Meanwhile, the T-44 is consistently not given this treatment, and I mean, maybe you could argue the fact that it did so much better than the FAL and the cold weather trials was it being given some sort of special treatment, when I think in reality it was maybe out of pity that happened, and then it just so happened that the underdog ended up beating the overdog in this particular case. And that was to everybody's surprise, and it made the Army sort of sit there on the decision for a year. But in the end, the decision was pretty clear. The M14 was a superior rifle to the FAL. Now, that all said, we've pretty much come to the conclusion of this story, right? The M14 gets adopted at this point, and all sorts of people's story about, well, they rigged all the tests. Where? Which tests? Please be specific. Which of these tests I've gone over were rigged in the comments? And you guy that's going to say it was rigged, which test was rigged? Which test specifically? What specific part of it was rigged? I would love to know, because I would like that to be the truth, but it just doesn't seem that way. What about favoritism? What about politics? It really seems to me like the FAL was the pick, right? The FAL had it made the entire time, because the T-44 was really just like a last-minute entry the first time it showed up, and it wasn't a complete rifle except for the last 2 trials it show up in. Well, I guess 3 trials if you count the restarted ones. FAL. But the M14 consistently, right? The T-44 consistently comes back, and it shows itself capable of doing good things, and the T-48 is needing constant mulligans by the time it's being manufactured here. Now, I can already understand, right? What the FAL copers will say is, Well, but they'd only been manufacturing it in the US for a couple of years. Meanwhile, they'd had so long for the T-44. They'd had almost identical amounts of times for both of them, except for the fact that the Canadians had started drawing up. The Canadians who had been figuring out making FALs on their own even sooner were sharing their homework with us. There was no homework to be shared with the T-44. That had to be done the hard way. The T-44 was like using a borrowed receiver for most of these trials. The T-44 really wasn't like a cohesive gun design there until pretty close to the very end. And it beats the FAL, a rifle that has actually had more development time regardless of who's manufacturing it. Because, again, mind you, the Mathewson-designed T-44 hadn't been manufactured by Springfield at all prior to Springfield manufacturing the 500 of them, and they just work. You can try and blame this on whatever you want. You can try and say that H&R was a dumb idiot gun manufacturer that didn't know what they were doing. You can come up with any cope that you want. But I think the facts speak for themselves. There's probably a follow-on video that I'll need to do to this as people flood into the comments to talk about how everything was wrong and, oh yeah, well, why did the M14 suck later on? And why is the FAL a good rifle today? Well, the FAL isn't a great rifle today. A lot of the countries that a bunch of countries did end up adopting it. That's true, because their options at the time were the FAL, because the U.S. wasn't going to share the M14. That was ours. We couldn't make enough for ourselves. And the people like to say, well, what about the G3? The G3 didn't exist. The SETME-C didn't even really exist at this point in time. People will say, what about the AR-10? The AR-10 was like, the AR-10 had its gas system at a 90 degree, like at the 9 o'clock position, at the 90 degree offset angle compared to where we know it today. It was a hilariously incomplete prototype in 1956. After the trials that were supposed to be the final trials were already over for the M14 and FAL. No, the AR-10 was not in contention ever. It showed up late. So what else would have been adopted? A bunch of the countries that had adopted the FAL, because there really wasn't another option for a rifle to adopt, had all sorts of complaints about the FAL. Chief among these was it not having a forward assist was something most of the countries that adopted it complain about in one form or another, especially the countries that ended up using it in sandy conditions. In fact, Israel goes and adopts an AK because their FALs don't work in the sand. I'm sure they would have loved to have had a forward assist on the stupid thing. People will point to the fact that the M14 was uncontrollable in full auto. Multiple countries that adopted the FAL took select fire out of it because it too is not useful in full auto. That's just sort of a nature of it being 308 in the first place. And you can blame America for the fact that the FAL ended up being in 308 instead of 280. But with the issues 280 was having, presuming they could have been solved, I still don't know that like having your 7mm, like arguably not even as effective at range as 7.62x39 rifle is really what you want. I don't know that you want that. Maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe you, the viewer, do. But I don't know that I want that very badly. But that's the FAL, right? Is that a lot of the countries that adopted it still had legitimate problems with it. I know after going through all of this stuff, we'll still have people in the comments heaping on, telling us all about how, well, actually the FAL was way better, and the tests were rigged, and the U.S. and the Ordnance Department, they were wrong, and they said it had to be the M14. But this isn't a thing that happened, right? It's not there. Where? I demand to see a source for this, because I went out looking for these sources, and what I found disappointed me. It turns out the M14 did not suck as bad as I wanted it to. That would have been funny, but it doesn't. I guess like I'd been before that, 2 tangents in a row there. Probably they'll have to do a video at some point where I talk about what then happened to the M14, because it's not really controversial to say that the M14 ended up in adoption flopping. And while the FAL and the various countries that adopted it, while it wasn't perfect, it was at least acceptable, if not good in some instances, right? Especially if you could keep it away from sandy environments, it was a good rifle. The M14, I don't think, ever made it quite to good. And there's probably a separate video to be made about why the FAL was good and why the M14 wasn't good. Most of what it comes down to is the fact that a lot of the improvements that had been made to the T-44 by way of Mathewson and Springfield going back and forth, right? They didn't stop iterating on the rifle while these trials were going on. While that year that was in limbo, they didn't stop iterating on improvements to the rifle. However, a lot of these improvements were things that Mathewson was making on their end to their like shorthand, quick notebook engineering drawings. Meanwhile, Springfield Armory was of the opinion that what it needs and what it does is a full technical data package. It's going to tell you how to make the tooling. It's going to tell you dimensions and heat treat and processes and notes and assembly steps and instructions. It's going to, essentially, it's going to put together a stack of paper that it can hand to a machine shop, and that machine shop can just start making M14s. That's what Springfield Armory wants to do. Mathewson isn't that outfit. Mathewson makes notes so that Mathewson can make parts in M14s, and that's all that they're concerned with doing. So a lot of the improvements and a lot of the design tweaks and enhancements to the M14 were happening at Mathewson. Sort of there, after the trials, after the adoption of the M14, Springfield asks for, we need more money, we need a little bit more time, we want to incorporate all of these improvements and all of these changes that Mathewson has. These all seem like good things. However, the Army, through Department of Defense, tells the Army to tell Springfield, the only thing you can implement is necessary changes without which the rifle will not work. And Springfield stops and looks at this and goes, we can't ask them for money. We don't get any money because none of these changes are necessary. The rifle works, but it would be a lot better if we could make all of these changes to it. And this sort of snowballs into the changes not getting made, manufacture of the rifle getting rushed out, manufacturers trying to make some changes on their own, and then a combination of manufacturers making changes and Springfield trying to make changes that aren't actually present on drawings and trying to improve the rifle in a cost savings measure results in inconsistent rifles being made. Department of Defense is of the opinion that Springfield shouldn't be making these rifles themselves because historically Springfield was the more expensive way to make rifles, whereas third-party manufacturers like Winchester was cheaper to manufacture these rifles. And so manufacturer was contracted out to Winchester, and Winchester's M14s were exploding. I believe H&R also made M14s, and they were breaking parts constantly. There was all sorts of problems with getting the M14 into manufacture. And these problems languished for long enough that by the time Department of Defense was like, where is all of this money going to? Springfield Armory is like, I don't know. And then Department of Defense was understandably upset by that. And the whole M14 program had been mismanaged to the point that rifles were unreliable. Rifles had all sorts of problems. There was a high reject rate for rifles. All sorts of crap was going on. And so this sort of reinforced the idea that the M14s that were being issued, for the most part, were good rifles because the bad ones were getting caught and then reworked and or scrapped and or salvaged for parts. And the whole manufacturing process of the rifle essentially went horribly wrong. I can maybe make a video at some point in the future that sort of delves into the details of that. The M14 book here that we've been going over on the right-hand side does go into sufficient detail about that. Finally, here as we're wrapping up, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This has been extremely long-winded, and I don't think it's been the most organized presentation ever, but it's pretty close to chronological order and just the highlights that people sort of need to know to understand these trials that I wanted to hit. Maybe at some point I'll make like a super short version of this video based off of this, but those are sort of the key points that you need to understand. If you guys are interested in this sort of video, I've got a Patreon. You can find that in the description. It'd be cool if you give me a money dollar to talk until my voice is sore about silly old rifles that nobody should even care about because they're not actually that great in the grand scheme of things. But that's sort of been this video. And I guess the last little bit of cope I want to head off here is that I know that somebody will comment on this video and be like, well, you just talked about the M14's development. Why don't you talk about how the FAL was developed? Well, that would be a subject of a completely different video. And then you'd get to the trial part, and the M14 would still do better. Included in the FAL book, there on the left-hand side, you do get a lot more of the insight from the UK. The UK is not happy about the US going. The UK is not happy about the T-44 advancing as long as it does. The Belgians are ass mad about it. The Belgians feel like they've been cheated this whole time, especially because they're early on. I think by the time of the 52 trials, the Belgians tell the US, here's the deal for you guys. We at FN will not charge the US for whatever rifles the US decides to manufacture for themselves. Unlimited license, make as many as you want. We only want a royalty whenever you, the United States, make a FAL and sell it to someone else. And this was FN being really savvy businessmen because they understood that if the US adopts the T-48 or an FAL at all, they're going to be making FALs for all sorts of their allies. FN was smart to try and catch this, but unfortunately it didn't work out for them because their rifle wasn't all that great when it came to actually testing it. But That's been the sort of short, concise history, the high points, just what you need to know about the development and history and adoption of the M14 there. I guess if you guys have questions, you can leave them in the comments, and then maybe I can answer those in a separate video or something. Anyway, I've been talking for long enough. I'm going to go do something else for a while. I will see you next time.